Gamers of the Underworld. Chapters 467 to 480. Chapter 467. Cafe. Yggdrasil? I see. I understand why it has such a large mana pool. Sherlock nodded. Lord Sherlock, I feel that we should let the gamers of Victoria City take over Yggdrasil. If Dragonborn is in the vicinity of Yggdrasil, we can find his location easily. If we have Yggdrasil, then we can start the open beta. The number of gamers will increase dramatically. With these gamers, it won't be a problem to conquer the world. Brew suggested excitedly. Sherlock remained aloof. He pondered for a while before saying, "Locate Yggdrasil, we need it. If we use violence, it will create unnecessary conflicts and start a full-scale war on the surface. It may also cause attention to focus on our dungeon, which may then bear the brunt of the surface world's attacks. Eternal Kingdom will be drawn in a costly battle." After analyzing the situation, he said, "We haven't completed our tasks in the Underworld. Taking over Yggdrasil and making more enemies isn't a good strategy. Of course, we have to plan to take over Yggdrasil properly. We can't let the chance slip by. Locate Dragonborn first." "I understand, Lord Sherlock. Don't worry, I'll locate Dragonborn," Brew said and remained silent. Sylvanas sat impatiently in the cage as she heard sounds of battle coming closer. The fighting was just outside the prison. However, she didn't know what happened, but the sounds of battle became softer and further. Had they failed? Sylvanas was worried. If they failed, would Not Wearing Pants and the rest be imprisoned as well? The members of Changan City were sly and cunning, capable of unscrupulous acts. It wouldn't be surprising if they imprisoned more high-ranking guild members. The battle lasted for almost 2 hours, which wasn't a short battle to the guilds. It was also difficult for the gamers to focus on fighting for 2 hours, especially when the game was ultra-realistic. Fighting drained both physical and mental energy. Sounds of battle were heard outside the prison, followed by a huge explosion. The prison door was blasted open, and the fragments flew all over the place. An orc Changan City gamer was sent flying by the explosion and landed in front of Sylvanas' cell. Sylvanas quickly picked up the gamer's longsword. It was only of green quality, but it was better than nothing. She could use the sword to kill herself and escape the prison. Sylvanas looked warily outside. It was filled with dust after the explosion. Though she wanted to go offline and ask Not Wearing Pants or Arthur about what was going on via WeChat or phone call, she was worried it might affect their battles. They had to focus on their fighting, and a phone call might cause their demise. After hesitating for a few days, Sylvanas decided to stay in prison and wait for their rescue. When the dust settled, a green-skinned orc dashed in. It was Not Wearing Pants. Sylvanas saw Not Wearing Pants and shouted excitedly, "You're finally here to rescue me. Get me out of here, hurry." Not Wearing Pants was depressed. He said to Sylvanas, "It's because of you that hundreds of our members had to come and save you. We were ambushed by Changan City's members after we attacked the stronghold. Now, we're all going to die and lose all of our equipment. How are you going to compensate us?" Sylvanas was stunned. She hadn't thought of that. She quickly said, "Sorry, bro, it wasn't intentional. Don't worry, I'll compensate all of the guild members who helped rescue me. I'll replace the lost equipment and improve them to level 5. The gamers who came in behind Not Wearing Pants shouted happily. "Sister Vanna's is awesome. Vanna's bro is gutsy." The gamers looked excited, while Sylvanas was bewildered. She noticed the difference in expressions of Not Wearing Pants and the gamers who just came in. "Silly dude, is Not Wearing Pants fooling me? Am I fooling you? I brought 100 members, and now only tens of them are left. How am I fooling you?" Not Wearing Pants shouted at Sylvanas. Not Wearing Pants was no longer serious. He laughed and said, "We were ambushed by Changan City and other guilds and were losing. However, Arthur brought a large group of members and turned the tide. We killed all members of Changan City and the other guilds and obtained their equipment. We even captured a high-ranking Changan City member. We'll imprison him for a few months to give him a taste of his own medicine." A gamer brought a bomb over and said to Sylvanas, "Sister Vanna's, please stand back. We'll be using a bomb to get you out." Sylvanas nodded and backed up 2 steps. The cage wasn't very large. If the bomb exploded, it would be dangerous. Sylvanas extended her hand and shouted, "Wait a moment, bro, there's not enough space." The gamer had already lit the bladder bomb in his hand. and the burning fuse was at its end. Though another gamer wanted to douse the fuse, he was stopped by Not Wearing Pants, who said, "It's too late. Let's run." Wait, shucks. Boom. That's awesome. I heard Arthur brought the Meat Vegetable Rice Alliance members to attack Chang'an City. Did the Meat Vegetable Rice Alliance and the Pioneer Alliance form an alliance? I didn't know that. Chang'an City was badly beaten by the Meat Vegetable Rice Alliance and the Pioneer Alliance. The neutral Pioneer Alliance is now involved in guild wars. The game is going to get very interesting. Join a guild, especially when all guilds are actively recruiting. You'll get a salary every week. I have received a salary for a few weeks as a guild member. No, I would rather be a non-affiliated gamer. In the commerce area of Eternal Kingdom, a shop that was rented by gamers was changed into a small cafe. The cafe had 10 tables and 40 seats, and more seats could be added depending on demand. Currently, the small shop was almost filled up. The name of the cafe was Marco Polo Fast Food Restaurant. Anybody could guess the owner of this shop. It was Marco Polo, who triggered the Old District's Strange Encounter mission. Marco Polo earned a large amount of magic stones from the Old District residents, and he used them to purchase Eternal Kingdom shops. He didn't invest in Winterfell shops because the development of Eternal Kingdom far exceeded Winterfell. The officials of Winterfell were favorable towards Eternal Kingdom, and the development of Eternal Kingdom would overshadow Winterfell. By then, the value of his shops might have multiplied many times. Earning magic stones wasn't Marco Polo's aim. His main aim was to set up a cafe and collect information from other gamers. Then he could earn magic stones to sustain his exploration expenses. Marco Polo obtained information about the battle between the Pioneer Alliance and Chang'an City. He wasn't concerned about the guild wars. He was more concerned about new maps and new routes. As his name suggested, he preferred exploration of maps, new gameplay, and finding Easter eggs rather than guild wars and daily missions. He obtained valuable information over the past few days. Chapter 468. Version 0.39 Update Log. Marco Polo placed a plate of clay dishes on a table. His main life skill was cooking, unlike the blacksmithing and carpentry that most gamers were interested in. Both blacksmithing and carpentry required lots of time and money. He wasn't concerned about earning money or upgrading his skills, so he preferred cooking. If he learned how to cook, he could prepare a delicious dish with a wok, some clay, and materials and sell it for a tidy sum. Setting up a cafe wasn't as profitable as becoming a blacksmith or carpenter, but it was still profitable. The most important task was to collect information. Most of the gamers wanted to patronize his cafe and try his food even though there were no buffs or benefits. The cafe allowed the gamers to have an immersive experience, and that was an important aspect. As the number of patrons increased, Marco Polo was able to collect more information. Recently, he gathered a piece of important information. A new underground forest. The underground forest wasn't discovered by the gamers. Some gamers heard about it from a Winterfell guard who obtained it from a gossip channel. The hidden forest was about a day's journey from Eternal Kingdom. Though it was a headache to solve math problems and cut down the trees, it was a bigger headache if there were no wooden logs. If Marco Polo could discover the forest, it would be a huge boost to the game development. It was an irresistible temptation for an explorer such as Marco Polo. The gamer who provided the information tried to find the forest, but he failed. The gamer didn't find anything in the direction that the information provided. The tunnels were too narrow for trees to grow. Marco Polo wanted to verify the information received by the gamer. He was prepared and could set off at any time. Rock climbing ropes, hooks, a walking stick, backup boots and gloves, a tent, a sleeping bag, light sticks, a handheld magic lantern, a compass, a stove, a thermos flask, and a potion. Those were the main items. It wasn't the first time Marco Polo went on an expedition. He was familiar with his tools. After preparation, he set off towards the location provided by the information. He had accumulated enough resources because he tutored the NPCs in the Old District. Even now, he was giving the kids classes to earn magic stones. He also purchased a darting bird from a gamer. The darting bird could carry his items and shorten his traveling time. The darting bird could shorten a day's journey to less than half a day, so Marco Polo soon arrived at the designated location. Like what the gamer had said, the tunnels were narrow. There were no monsters and no forked road. There was also no forest. Most of the hidden tunnels weren't apparent. Marco Polo knew that he would have to put in some effort to find the hidden forest. In front of him was a long tunnel. There were no complex paths or forked roads. However, if he searched the area, he was sure he could find something. He stopped the darting bird at the tunnel and took out a small hammer. He knocked continuously on the walls to find hidden mechanisms or hidden tunnels. He searched for a long time, but he didn't find any hidden locations. However, he didn't give up and continued searching. When he hit the wall this time, he heard a crisp echo from within. He was surprised. He took out a small shovel from his bag and started knocking on the wall. The wall wasn't thick, it was hollow. When he hit it the third time, there was a hole in the wall. The rest was simple. Marco Polo continued hitting for half an hour, and soon, the wall was broken down. There was a hidden tunnel behind the wall that he had just cleared. It was dark inside without any vines that provided illumination. As a precaution, he set up a stake and tied the darting bird to it. He then placed most of his items on the darting bird. After that, he tied a rope to his waist and took out his handheld magic lantern as he walked into the tunnel. The tunnel was pitch black and spacious. He felt around and confirmed that there were no forked paths, then walked along the tunnel for 30 minutes. His horizon widened. Illumination appeared at the end of the tunnel. The end of the tunnel was a huge cliff that had glowing vines below it. The most important thing was the valley below, which was full of luscious trees that stretched beyond the horizon. Gosh, have I found the forest already? Marco Polo was exhilarated. He had to find ways to climb down the cliff to the valley below. When he was pondering how to get down, a team of orcs came out from the side. The orcs were wearing safety helmets that had magic lamps on them, and they were holding ropes in their hands. They were surprised to see Marco Polo, as they didn't expect to see other creatures there. Because Marco Polo was focused on finding hidden gameplay and locations, he didn't upgrade his combat power. He also didn't go for combat training. Like hemp rope technology, he was focused on his interests. As such, he was still of the lowly goblin race. The orcs were taken aback at finding a fully armed and equipped goblin. The orcs hesitated before charging at Marco Polo. "Catch him! Don't let him escape!" someone shouted. Marco Polo quickly fled so that he could evade capture by the team of orcs. But a goblin was unable to outrun orcs, especially in such treacherous terrain, where he had nowhere to run. Soon, Marco Polo was captured and tied up with ropes. "What shall we do? Why is there a goblin?" The orcs started talking. One of the orcs noticed the green symbols above Marco Polo's head and was dumbstruck. He said, "Wait, this creature is from Eternal Kingdom. Look at the green symbols above his head. The creatures from Eternal Kingdom have the same symbols." Eternal Kingdom? Didn't they defeat Lord Morgan and Lord Andrew? Marco Polo recalled that Morgan and Andrew were both successors to Eternal Fire. Morgan was Andrew's brother and the second successor to Eternal Fire, while Andrew was the third successor to Eternal Fire. They were defeated by the Valiant Gamers. Were these orcs related to Eternal Fire? Otherwise, how did they know about Morgan and Andrew? Perhaps Morgan and Andrew were too notorious, so they heard about them. "We can't keep him alive. Let's kill him. We can't let other creatures know of our stronghold below. This forest belongs to us," one of the orcs said. Marco Polo wanted to explain and make use of his glib tongue, but before he could speak, an orc placed a knife to his neck. He cut Marco Polo's throat, killing him. When he recovered, Marco Polo was at the revival interface. Peering into the darkness, Marco Polo was stunned for a long time. Then he appeared at the revival point. He looked bewildered at the bustling Eternal Kingdom. His darting bird and other equipment were lost. Marco Polo didn't recover himself for a few minutes. He was overwhelmed with grief. Marco Polo didn't like to train in combat techniques or go after combat equipment. It wasn't easy for him to buy a darting bird and equipment for exploration. Now, they were lost. Nobody could understand his sense of loss. He wailed loudly. He was going to get some gamers to kill those orcs. Sherlock returned to the Dungeon Lord main hall from the Winterfell Manor. He let Evelyn rest for a week so that she could forget the unpleasant incident at the manor. She wouldn't be in a good mood after learning that a monster was residing in her body. Especially when she was timid and conservative. Eggface and the parrot returned to the Dungeon Lord main hall, but Sherlock didn't open the cabinet that Polio was locked in. Sherlock discovered that the gamers had a new goal and plan. According to the gamers, the game officials had updated new content. Sherlock tried to recall, but he didn't know what content he had updated. He was busy dealing with the Merchant Alliance, so he didn't have time to bother with new gameplay or maps. The current gameplay and maps were sufficient for the gamers. In fact, they didn't even have enough time to complete their daily missions. Moreover, there was the newly built crossroad intersection outpost that allowed the gamers to work. There were many factories that required the gamers to work in them. If they didn't work hard in the factories and earn the reputation points of the crossroad intersection outpost to exchange for equipment, then what were they planning? To motivate the gamers, Sherlock created mana skills books and legendary equipment as rewards that could be exchanged for using reputation points. Sherlock accessed the discussion forum and started browsing. He found the content that conveyed the new goal of the gamers. I discovered a new underground forest. A new underground forest? Sherlock was taken aback. He quickly accessed the post and started reading. I am Marco Polo, and I'm sharing my adventure with everyone. It's related to the discovery of a new underground forest. Let me show you my custom-made map. Picture. This is the hidden path that I discovered at the tunnel. I used a small shovel to create a hole. If you discover it, you can enter it. I left a darting bird and my equipment at the entrance. However, when I returned to look for them, they were missing. If you find them nearby, please tell me. I will be very grateful. The important thing that I'm going to say is that there are other creatures at the underground forest. There were 7 to 8 orcs who killed me. If you see them, please kill them to avenge me. I'm not sure if they built a stronghold or if there are other races, as I was captured and killed after entering. That is despicable. From their conversation, I'm guessing that they are related to Eternal Fire. That's because they mentioned Morgan and Andrew, who were from Eternal Fire. I believe that, in the future, Eternal Fire will be our next target. Before that, we have to take over the underground forest. I'm divulging this information without any compensation because I hope that everyone can have new gameplay. Yinny 1994. You're indeed a veteran. You are sharing this information without any compensation. Lusty Insane Jong. Awesome. I'm going there to take a look. If I see those orcs, I'll help you kill them. Chen 11. Our guild is ready to set off. XXX Guild is recruiting members. Peaceful Pickaxe Handle. Hey, previous commenter, is your guild XXX? Not wearing pants. You're awesome. The post created by Marco Polo wasn't long. The rest of the posts consisted of pictures. The gamers replied and showed their respect for him for divulging the location of the underground forest instead of keeping it to himself. If the gamers were to discover the underground forest, they would cut the trees in secret without letting anyone know. Even if there were hostile monsters, they would kill them repeatedly using revivals. Marco Polo's post made the gamers curious and excited. The forest that Eternal Kingdom and Winterfell had signed an agreement on was now barren. The gamers were excited that a new forest had been located. After all, they required the wood for upgrading their equipment and for building furniture and houses. The wood provided by Victoria City was limited and expensive. That was the new content update that the gamers were talking about. Marco Polo discovered a new underground forest, and it's close to Eternal Kingdom. Yet, we didn't know about it. Sherlock muttered to himself, and Brew replied, I didn't expect it either, Lord Sherlock. I calculated the area of the underground forest. We can't demark the underground forest within the radius of the dungeon core unless I upgrade 2 levels. After Brew assimilated several dungeon cores, he had attained level 4. As Sherlock was unable to provide enough mana, the 4th beta testing, also known as the open beta, wasn't implemented. Sherlock had to solve the mana shortage problem before implementing the open beta. Otherwise, Sherlock and Lilo would be sucked dry by the numerous gamers who were going to join the game. The current solution was to find a mature Yggdrasil, which was discovered by Dragonborn. Sherlock hadn't found a way to link up the Yggdrasil and his dungeon core secretly. If he took over Yggdrasil by force, it would create a world war. Even if he depended on the game's power, they would be unable to stop the attacks from all over the world. Lord Sherlock, I feel that it's a good chance to take over the underground forest. Though we are unable to extend the radius of the dungeon core, nobody owns the underground forest. As we're the closest dungeon, it's unlikely that there are other dungeons around. Sherlock nodded in agreement. He ordered Brew, Prepare a new daily mission to direct the gamers to build a stronghold and teleport portal at the underground forest. I'll arrange for new Beetleman routes to the forest. I feel it's time for a content update. Sherlock started editing the official update post. Version 0.39 update announcement. Dear gamers, after half a year, it's now time for version 0.39. We will introduce the detailed contents of version 0.39 to all gamers. We updated the new stronghold, Crossroad Intersection Outpost, a new complete city. All gamers of Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom can carry out their daily activities without any harm. It's a safety zone in which gamers cannot attack other gamers, including opposing factions. Gamers can also receive special Crossroad Intersection Outpost daily missions and corresponding reputation points upon completion. The reputation points can be exchanged for mana skills books and legendary equipment. However, a longer time is required to complete the daily missions at the Crossroad Intersection Outpost. We added new gameplay, working in factories. There are new factories at the Crossroad Intersection Outpost. They belong to Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom and not other dungeons or contractors. All gamers who work in the factories can obtain reputation points. We provide support for fixed long-term work systems, such as working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. from Monday to Saturday. This is the future of our work system. We added a new NPC, Frangipani. Though the name is the same as the Ancient Gods Army commander, he's not the same commander. He's a pet tortoise purchased by Lord Sherlock. His function is unknown, but he's going to be an important NPC in the future. We updated a new map, Unknown Forest. This is an underground forest hidden in the dark tunnels. We aren't sure of the name. The forest's location was determined by Marco Polo. Gamers can explore the forest and gain generous rewards. We updated new content, Victoria City's Wyvern. This was the wyvern that attacked the gamers of Victoria City. We don't know the location of the wyvern, but we hope you can capture it. The possibility of capturing it is pretty low. We updated new content, Goldshire Town. This is a small town on the surface world. It belongs to the Duke of York. The mayor of Goldshire Town has a close relationship with Lancelot's wife, Guinevere. Goldshire Town seems to be allied with Victoria City instead of the cruel Duke of York. This is a good chance to diminish the power of the Duke of York. We updated Healing Mana skill. After Raintea's strange encounter mission, we are providing an exchange system for the Healing Mana skill. All gamers of Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom can exchange for this skill using mana skills books. We updated with a new usage of the power of Sacred Light. The power of Sacred Light can be used to heal the wounds of Victorians, but it can't be used to heal gamers of Eternal Kingdom. The gamers of Eternal Kingdom can only be healed by using potions or healing mana skills. We updated with a new bug. If you reveal the location of the newly discovered underground forest to other NPCs, your character will die suddenly, and all of your equipment will be destroyed. This isn't a joke. I'm leaving a wild card. If you find any new content that I didn't write, feel free to add it. Sherlock checked through the post. After some pondering, he added a few more words. I will give a preview of the coming open beta. We have released the two factions, Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom, and created the plot and gameplay. The current game isn't the final game version. We will implement various changes in the open beta. If you have any good suggestions, feel free to post them in the forum. We welcome all discussions. The crux of the open beta rests on the result of Dragonborn's strange encounter. Yggdrasil is an important factor that can speed up the start of the open beta. We will release more content about Yggdrasil. All gamers should be well prepared. Your main goal will be to develop the plot for the start of the open beta. I hope that everyone has a fun time. Love from the game producer, Sherlock. Chapter 469. Stronghold in Unknown Forest. Source of Dawn. Polio, Phoenix, and Frangipani. They aren't big bosses, they are Sherlock's pet names. Peaceful pickaxe handle. Yggdrasil has been targeted. Even Jesus can't save it now. Slag nest. I suddenly thought of mana replenishment, manual comedy. The content updates in version 0.39 were numerous. In the coming future, there would be more new content. In order to implement the open beta testing, the gamers of Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom had to cooperate to take over Yggdrasil. This was what the gamers speculated. If they had Yggdrasil, then the game could implement open beta. The Yggdrasil plot had been triggered by Dragonborn's strange encounter mission. The gamers didn't know the location of Dragonborn, but they knew it was only a matter of time. There were many updates, like a new map at Eternal Kingdom for the Unknown Forest. It didn't mean that the forest was called Unknown Forest. The lazy game officials were simply too lazy to give the forest a proper name. The gamers were used to the laziness of the game officials. Most of the names on the maps were given by the gamers, including the various areas in the dungeon and the Sighing Wilderness, where the Ogre Fortress was located. After discussion, the gamers suggested using Moonlight Forest, but the name was already used by the forest at Victoria City. The gamers couldn't come up with a good name. All the guilds had sent their members to the forest. As such, there were 10 beetlemans that serviced the route between Eternal Kingdom and the Unknown Forest. If a beetleman could only carry 100 gamers, 10 beetlemans could only carry 1,000 gamers. However, there were 5,000 gamers in Eternal Kingdom. There was no consideration for the fact that an orc's body was much larger than a gnome. Perhaps a beetleman wasn't able to ferry 100 orcs. Most of the guild members organized their darting birds and formed groups to ferry their members to the entrance of the forest. However, this method wasn't feasible for non-affiliated gamers. Marco Polo's post had stated clearly that the entrance was pitch dark. It wasn't suitable for darting birds to go in, as they would panic in the dark environment. Many gamers complained about the darkness phobia of darting birds when the birds were living in the underworld. The gamers had no choice, as it was a game setting. The end was a steep cliff, and the gamers could climb down, but the darting birds were unable to do so. A lone non-affiliated gamer wouldn't know where to put his darting bird. Marco Polo, who was a lone adventurer, lost his darting bird and equipment. The gamers of Eternal Kingdom couldn't steal each other's rides. If a gamer had a darting bird and another gamer killed the owner, the second gamer was unable to take the darting bird. Of course, he could choose to kill the darting bird. For opposing factions, the gamers could steal each other's rides. For example, gamers of Victoria City could kill the owners of the darting birds and take their rides. This fact was confirmed at the Sighing Wilderness. The Pioneer Alliance organized its members to explore the Unknown Forest. As a 500-member guild, it organized a group with 300 members, each having a darting bird. They also arranged for extra tens of darting birds to carry loot and necessities such as tents, lamps, food, and water. The gamers knew that there was hunger and exhaustion in the game. If the gamers didn't eat and rest sufficiently, their combat power would be greatly diminished. There was even some food that had a special buff that increased their agility. That was what the food description said. However, it wasn't clear whether the food was effective. Most of the gamers believed the food to be effective, though there wasn't an attribute panel for confirmation. Could the description be used to deceive the gamers? After the battle between the Pioneer Alliance and Chang'an City, the Pioneer Alliance was able to have a sizable force. One reason was that there were more rich gamers in the Pioneer Alliance. The other main reason was that after attacking the two Chang'an City strongholds, they pillaged the enemy's resources and captured their high-ranking members. Arthur didn't want to build a stronghold in the wilderness to imprison the high-ranking members of Chang'an City. He found a convenient location to imprison them and got some guild members to keep watch. He didn't care how long they were imprisoned. Arthur was nonchalant about whether Chang'an City was willing to spend money to rescue the prisoners. The imprisonment was a method to tarnish the guild's reputation and serve as a warning. It wasn't meant to keep them locked up for a long time. There were 300 Pioneer Alliance members and other allied guild members that made up the 500 to 600 members that set off from Eternal Kingdom towards the Unknown Forest. The contingent looked like a long dragon. Under good management of the guilds, the contingent traveled orderly towards the destination. There was no way unaffiliated gamers could have such an orderly contingent. As it was a large contingent, the speed wasn't as fast as Marco Polo's traveling speed. The 600-member contingent traveled for half a day before it arrived at the entrance of the Unknown Forest. 100 of the members went offline for various reasons, but they weren't abandoned. Instead, they were placed on the backs of the darting birds or tied to the carts. If they were left on the road, their equipment would be stolen. The darting birds couldn't be stolen, but if a piece of equipment wasn't soulbound, it could be stolen. It was almost night time when they arrived at the entrance of the Unknown Forest. It was also the time when most of the gamers were online. Most of the unaffiliated gamers would choose to take the Beetlemans and go offline to do other stuff. When they got online again, they would have arrived at a Beetleman stop. Even if the Beetleman arrived early, their friends would inform them via messaging. Then they would go online immediately and dismount from the Beetleman. The gamers were safe from attacks and stealing when they were on the Beetleman. More gamers were online at night. When Arthur and his members arrived at the unknown forest, there was a vast crowd at the narrow tunnel. It wasn't a good choice to set up camp at the tunnel entrance. Arthur ordered half the members to stay, while the rest of the members escorted the darting birds back. They could then return to the unknown forest via the teleport portal, which would be built shortly. Arthur and half of his members proceeded into the tunnel to explore the unknown forest. Arthur wasn't worried that the Changan City members would take revenge. As there were many gamers, if the Changan City members attacked, there would be accidental damage to other gamers, who would retaliate immediately. Changan City would have antagonized other guilds and unaffiliated gamers besides the Pioneer Alliance and its allies. Changan City wouldn't be so foolish as to do that. Arthur and his 300 members brought along their essential equipment and entered the tunnel of the unknown forest. Almost 1,000 gamers were jostling in the tunnel. After 30 minutes, they exited the tunnel and arrived at the spacious top of the cliff. The gamers had to find a way to climb down the cliff, like what Marco Polo encountered. They walked around but didn't find any tunnels that went down. They could only scale down the steep cliff. Though the constitution of orcs, gnomes, and goblins was pretty good, without proper training and safeguards, it was as good as suicide. The gamers were multi-talented. They chose a few expert rock climbers from the 5,000 gamers of Eternal Kingdom to scale down the cliff. Many gamers came forward and revealed their professional rock climbing experience. They also requested spider silk and ropes to create a ladder. It wasn't difficult to overcome this cliff. The gamers were familiar with the tensile strength of the spider silk. Even if tens of orcs bore weight on the spider silk, it would be able to support them. Once the gamers were united, their efficiency skyrocketed. Before long, they created tens of meters of rope ladder using the contributed spider silk. Then they used wooden stakes and rocks to fix one end of the rope ladder before throwing it down the cliff. They climbed the rope ladder down in an orderly fashion. This took quite some time, but there were no other choices. The impatient gamers could choose to climb down by themselves, but those without proper training met with a grotesque end. Arthur and his members contributed the most spider silk, so they had priority in using the ladder. The 300 members spent more than an hour to gather in the forest. The forest was lit up by faint light, and it looked like a fantasy scene. The game's mission was to make a clearing in the forest so that they could build a stronghold and a teleport portal. Then, Brainiac would activate the teleport portal. When the gamers were scaling the ladder, Brainiac used mana to float down the cliff. He chose a good location for the teleportation of the rune mana formation's materials. The learned gamers started logging the trees while the other gamers explored the area. Learning couldn't be forced on the gamers. Though Arthur was good in his studies, he didn't stay at the stronghold and log trees. He didn't require any wood, and his improved equipment was at the maximum level. Arthur didn't want any furniture or need to make bows or arrows. He led 100 members to explore other parts of the unknown forest. According to Marco Polo, there were other orcs. Perhaps, there might be other strongholds at the far end of the map. Arthur was going for the equipment of those orcs. Compared to logging wood, they preferred to obtain the NPC's equipment. The size of the unknown forest went beyond Arthur's imagination. After exploring for more than 2 hours, they didn't reach the forest boundary. They didn't find any strongholds or traces of the orcs either. On the other side of the map, other gamers discovered something and shared their findings on the discussion forum. It was a stronghold with a campfire. From the stronghold size, there were a lot of creatures. There were hundreds of orcs and gnomes patrolling the perimeter. They cleared a large area for defense purposes. It wasn't clear where they came from. After all, the underground forest was so huge that it could be connected to other tunnels. So, they could have come in from other tunnels. To the gamers of Eternal Kingdom, they were enemies. Even without being antagonized, the gamers saw them as enemies with red names. The gamers who discovered the stronghold were small in number. They didn't have the courage to dash in and take a look. They would lose all of their equipment if they died. They retreated immediately after discovering the stronghold and shared the information on the discussion forum. The other guilds learned about this and deployed a group to the enemy stronghold location. The orcs in the enemy stronghold weren't aware of an impending attack. Chapter 470. Decline. The unknown forest stronghold was about an hour's journey from the steep cliff. Most of the gamers felt that the journey was too long. If there was no strong reason, they wouldn't travel the distance just to fight monsters. It was common for the gamers to travel for half an hour just to fight monsters or complete a mission, and they were used to it. If the gamers had to travel on the airship or a beetleman for half a day, they would go offline and do some self-study. When the airship or beetleman arrived at the destination, the gamers would receive reminders from their friends via WeChat or QQ. An hour was too far for the gamers to walk. Fortunately, there were teleport portals. Brainiac was able to create a rune mana formation for a teleport portal fast, as he did it many times. Within 2 hours of reaching the unknown forest, Brainiac had created a rune mana formation for a teleport portal at a valley of the unknown forest. Sherlock was very concerned about the underground forest, so he spent a fortune to purchase the materials for the rune mana formation. After the teleport portal was completed, more and more gamers traveled via the portal to participate in building the game's stronghold. Beetlemans that were used as transportation tools between Eternal Kingdom and the unknown forest were teleported to the forest valley. The beetlemans were to be used to transport the gamers to the enemy stronghold. Before the first beetleman arrived at the enemy stronghold, Arthur had brought his guild members and other guild members to the location to do surveillance. There were also unaffiliated gamers scouting around the area. They couldn't wait for the teleport portal and the beetleman routes to be established. The orcs and gnomes in the enemy stronghold noticed the arrival of the unwelcome guests. They shut the door of their stronghold and went on high alert. They then sent out a gnome emissary who shouted at the gamers, "Warriors of Eternal Kingdom. We're from the northern office of Eternal Fire. We came here in peace and offer our friendship. This underground forest isn't occupied by anyone. If you're interested, we can develop the forest together." A goblin from the gamer's side came forward and shouted, "Nonsense, you just killed me. You call that peaceful and friendly?" That was Marco Polo, who was killed by the enemy orcs. The enemy gnome didn't expect his offer of friendship to be declined bluntly. He was embarrassed, but he said with thick skin, "I think there's a misunderstanding. We have never killed any citizens of Eternal Kingdom. The deed could have been done by the second and third successors of Eternal Fire. It has nothing to do with Eternal Fire. They were merely successors and not the Dungeon Lord. You must be clear about that. Our Dungeon Lord would never do anything to harm the peace of the Underworld. We are here for peace and prosperity." Though the enemy gnome was glib-tongued, the gamers didn't believe him, as their orcs had killed Marco Polo mercilessly. That was the truth. The gnome's words had no bearing. Most importantly, their names were red in color. As long as their names were red, their flattering words were useless. They were monsters to be attacked. A gamer dashed out towards the emissary since his name was red and he was wearing a beautiful costume. The clothes were fashionable. The game didn't have shops selling fashionable clothes. To the gamers, fashionable clothing was a necessity. Most of the clothes of the NPCs were good. As long as the clothes weren't damaged when they were stripped, the gamers were happy wearing them. The good thing about the game was that the equipment didn't have expiration dates. This included fashionable costumes. Some online games made players pay money and placed expiration dates on clothing. To ensure that he wouldn't damage the costume, the gamer used a metal club instead of a sharp weapon to hit the emissary on his head. The emissary didn't have a chance to evade and fell to the ground. Wah, his reaction was fast. "I should have used a club to knock the gnome out. I don't want to listen to his crap. I'm regretting it. I shouldn't have listened to his nonsense. Oh my god." The gamers felt regretful, but it was too late. The gamer who killed the gnome had the loot. Unfortunately, the costume was sized for a gnome, so it could only be sold to a gnome. The orc gamer who hit the emissary wasn't able to wear the costume. The conflict escalated. The emissary was killed, so there was no chance for a peaceful resolution. The gamers attacked the enemy stronghold. The enemy stronghold responded with a series of raining arrows, some black and red mana exploding rockets, and various elemental attacks from behind the rock walls. There were only about 500 to 600 gamers, and they were devastated by the first wave of long-range attacks. Most of the unscathed gamers fled instantly. They were mainly acting as scouts to collect intelligence. If the gate of the enemy stronghold was open, they would use the chance to pillage the enemy. However, they didn't have such a chance. The gamers were defeated by the first wave of attack from Eternal Fire's northern section. In the stronghold of Eternal Fire, a few commanders who were wearing armor of superior quality gathered at a table that had a huge sand table map. The sand table's terrain was the physical model of the unknown forest and its valley. Who can tell me how information was divulged? How did the warriors of Eternal Kingdom find this location? How did they discover this hidden underground forest? An orc commander who was standing in the middle looked gravely at everyone. He was in a terrible mood. Nobody dared to utter a word. Not even a single breath could be heard. After a long time, a gnome trembled as he said, "Commander, I feel that it's not the time to find blame. We have to solve our current problem. We started a fight with Eternal Kingdom, and we need to use diplomacy to resolve the problems. Eternal Kingdom isn't a dungeon to be trifled with. Lord Morgan and Andrew have been sent to prison by Eternal Kingdom." All of the other members nodded in agreement. The commander pondered hard. He had to solve the problem fast. If we send another emissary to Lord Sherlock to explain the situation, he will understand our defensive motive. It was Eternal Kingdom that attacked first. "We didn't start the conflict," another orc said. "That's correct. If we tell Sherlock that we'll relinquish the forest to him, I believe Lord Sherlock won't attack us." "I heard he's a magnanimous devil." "Magnanimous devil? Are you joking? I haven't heard of a devil who is magnanimous. Do you know how many magic stones and resources Sherlock has blackmailed the Merchant Alliance and Eternal Fire for?" The commander looked ghastly as he spoke. "From what I heard, he blackmailed the Merchant Alliance and us for 50 million magic stones. That isn't the most frightening part. He actually sacrificed the lives of his citizens to obtain the magic stones. Do you believe that? Most of the compensation was for death compensation. Can you imagine the number of casualties sustained by Eternal Kingdom?" A creature at the side commented, I also heard that the warriors of Eternal Kingdom weren't afraid of death. They weren't afraid of death and were a bit perverted. They were looking forward to death. And what's terrifying is that they laughed when they were dying. During the battle, they were more concerned about protecting their equipment than saving their comrades. I have never seen such warriors before. During the middle of battle, many of their warriors become naked green troops without any equipment. Then they pick up weapons from the battlefield and continue fighting. That's scary. What a horrifying dungeon. The group chatted until the commander banged on the table. He shouted, "Enough. I know how awesome Eternal Kingdom is. I don't need you to repeat it. I will report our situation to Eternal Fire and send an emissary to Eternal Kingdom to negotiate with Lord Sherlock. No matter how the warriors of Eternal Kingdom taunt us, we shall not retaliate. We will only defend and prevent them from coming into our stronghold. If we retain this stronghold, we will have territorial rights over this forest." Everyone became quiet. His order wasn't feasible. How could they not retaliate? If they didn't retaliate, with the current defenses, the stronghold would be overrun. But it was an order, and they had no choice but to obey it. They hoped to come to a resolution with Lord Sherlock as soon as possible. As for the negotiation with Lord Sherlock, "Please take a seat." Sherlock pointed to the chair in front as he spoke to the werewolf. The werewolf was an emissary of Eternal Fire. He had arrived at Eternal Kingdom via the Winterfell teleport portal after approval from Sherlock. Sherlock invited the werewolf to take a seat politely. Eggface brewed a cup of bloody chrysanthemum tea diligently and placed it before Sherlock, then returned to his computer. "Lord Sherlock, I believe you are aware of my intentions." The werewolf looked at Sherlock, who didn't show any remorse. Sherlock gazed at the werewolf and replied, "I know, you're here to discuss compensation, aren't you?" "Wait, what compensation?" The werewolf was dumbstruck. Sherlock quickly said, "That's correct, it's regarding compensation for the loss of Eternal Kingdom. 500 of my citizens were killed in the underground forest belonging to Eternal Kingdom. I have video evidence." Sherlock took out a few adamantine rocks and infused them with mana. Images appeared from the adamantine rocks. The images showed the first-person perspective of numerous arrows and mana rockets flying towards the camera at the forest stronghold. There were explosions all around. Each series of images only lasted a few seconds. When the images were stitched together, it showed the gamers being massacred by Eternal Fire's long-range attacks at the stronghold. "Wait a moment, Lord Sherlock. Perhaps you don't understand the entire incident. The warriors of Eternal Kingdom killed our emissary and stripped his clothing. They even wielded weapons and attacked our stronghold. Take a look at the bladder object in the images. Isn't that a bomb made by Eternal Kingdom? The werewolf was very familiar with Eternal Kingdom and did his homework before coming. Sherlock remained composed as he said, I think we shouldn't have any misunderstandings. Your orcs killed my goblin, so my warriors went to your stronghold to demand justice. Sherlock took out another piece of adamantine rock and infused it with mana, and a series of images appeared before them. It was the first-person perspective of a goblin as a few orcs surrounded him. They spoke about eternal fire and threatened to kill him. Then, an orc took out a knife and slit the goblin's throat. The goblin died. That was the recorded video created by Marco Polo before he was killed by the orcs from eternal fire. The later images showed the emissary walking out of the stronghold and denying killing the goblin of Eternal Kingdom. Then the emissary was clubbed to death by a warrior of Eternal Kingdom. We have strong evidence. Moreover, the underground forest is within the boundary of Eternal Kingdom, while eternal fire is so far away. Why did you build a stronghold in my territory and kill my warriors? Is eternal fire declaring war on Eternal Kingdom? Sherlock said as he looked bewilderedly at the werewolf. The werewolf didn't expect Sherlock to have evidence. When the orcs killed the goblin, they didn't see the goblin holding any image recording devices. How did Sherlock obtain those incriminating images? The werewolf couldn't figure it out, but the evidence was laid out before him. Even if Eternal Fire made a complaint to the Devil Management Committee, the Devil Management Committee would side with Sherlock. However, Eternal Fire had its reasons for not giving up the underground forest. The werewolf said to Sherlock, Lord Sherlock, I believe these are just some misunderstandings. Eternal Fire is sincere in reaching a resolution with Eternal Kingdom. Let bygones be bygones. We're willing to offer triple compensation for your losses during the conflict. In addition, we're willing to provide additional compensation to you in order to lease the underground forest. The rental price will be very attractive to you. Don't worry about money. As he spoke, the werewolf gestured out a figure with his finger. That was a figure that a normal dungeon lord wouldn't decline. Sherlock pondered for a while and said, I decline. Chapter 471. Escape. The negotiation between Sherlock and the emissary of Eternal Fire ended in failure. The proposal of the werewolf was tempting, but Sherlock didn't have the intention to agree. After 3 failed attempts to persuade Sherlock, the werewolf left, dejected. Eternal Fire didn't give up on resolving the conflict with Eternal Kingdom. In the following days, Eternal Fire sent an emissary daily to present gifts to Sherlock. Even officials from the Merchant Alliance came to mediate their conflict. Then news of the discovery of the secret forest near Eternal Kingdom spread like wildfire. The Merchant Alliance and other dungeons at the boundary of the secret forest wanted to have a share of the newfound resource. But the other dungeons weren't as close to the forest as Eternal Kingdom. The gamers didn't participate in other activities during these few days. They concentrated on building their own stronghold in the secret forest and attacking Eternal Fire's stronghold. The game's attacks were neutralized by Eternal Fire. Some gamers wanted to use suicide bombing to blast open the gate of the stronghold. However, they were stopped by mana defenses, long-range arrows, and attacks from magicians. They were killed before reaching the walls of the stronghold. As the largest dungeon in the northern underworld, Eternal Fire had strong capabilities. The gamers were unable to penetrate the defenses of the enemy stronghold. If the gamers used the Gundam, it could be a different story. However, Sherlock didn't intend to use the Gundam. The deaths of the gamers were creating wealth for Sherlock. Every dead warrior of Eternal Kingdom would require death compensation. When the war was over, Sherlock could obtain large amounts of compensation. Hence, Sherlock didn't stop his gamers' suicidal attacks. The gamers tried many times to attack, but they were stopped by the defenses of Eternal Fire. The attacks dwindled. Eventually, only a few guilds organized attacks on Eternal Fire's stronghold. The other gamers were busy logging the trees in the secret forest. To the Underworld residents, logging was a decadent activity. But to the gamers, it was no problem. A lot of gamers became passionate learners after playing the game. Sherlock wasn't bothered with this, as he was busy trying to discover the treasure of the secret forest. He was curious why Eternal Fire wasn't bothered by the logging activities of Eternal Kingdom. The emissaries sent by Eternal Fire didn't ask Eternal Kingdom to give up the forest resources. Eternal Fire only wished to lease the land and was willing to give up all of the wood to Eternal Kingdom. Sherlock was sure the stronghold of Eternal Fire wasn't built for securing wood. Eternal Fire must be looking for an object, but Sherlock wasn't sure what it was. He believed that if he continued to occupy the forest, he would learn Eternal Fire's secret. While Eternal Kingdom was fighting against Eternal Fire at the secret forest, the gamers of Victoria City had arrived at the York territory. Lancelot didn't bring along many gamers. Besides Big Boss Hamster, who was tasked with building a teleport portal, there were only about 100 gamers who were disguised as mercenary guards. Hence, they didn't encounter any resistance when they entered the York territory. Lancelot was skilled in choosing a location for a hidden stronghold. He found a suitable location for the stronghold at the boundary of the York territory. It was in a valley with surrounding high ground, and it had only one entrance. To the gamers, who could revive unlimited times, this was the most suitable location. As long as they weren't killed simultaneously, they could continue fighting using revivals. This was the reason Lancelot chose this location. Big Boss Hamster followed Lilo's instruction to create the Rune Mana teleport portal, which took a day. The gamers stood guard nearby to protect the teleport portal. It wasn't really crucial to stand guard, as there were no people around. The surface world humans weren't familiar with Rune Mana formations. The stronghold teleport portal was connected directly to the portal in Victoria City. The gamers arrived at the York territory via the teleport portal. They used tools and materials to construct the stronghold. They loved building the walls and houses. Lancelot was unable to understand their passion for construction. Only laborers would do such a job, but the gamers enjoyed doing it. They were even willing to use their own money to buy materials for construction. Lancelot believed that building was their hobby. He was also concerned about his wife, Guinevere. Though he was unwilling, Queen Victoria had betrothed Guinevere to him even though he didn't know if Guinevere was a man or woman. Guinevere said he was a man, but Lancelot observed that Guinevere wasn't like a man. He felt that Guinevere was trying to protect herself and thus lied about being a man. In novels, it was common for the male protagonist to encounter the female protagonist who was disguised as a man. Lancelot imagined that, in the novel, he would protect Guinevere and die on the battlefield. As a knight, he could accept such an ending. The gamers didn't know that Lancelot had wild imaginations. They only wanted to finish building the stronghold and pillage the castle of the Duke of York. The distant European-style castle showed traces of opulence and created a great deal of anticipation in the gamers. They wanted to occupy it very badly. Some gamers started planning the occupation of the castle, while other gamers were wondering whether the castle was like a second Winterfell. In the distant forest of the fairies, Dragonborn had been held captive for 5 or 6 days. He did nothing much except help the fairies repair their treehouses. He was being treated like he was their slave. As a legendary fugitive warrior, Tomato didn't fare any better. He didn't receive any special treatment. To the fairies, he was like a common human, and Tomato conformed to their expectations. The 2 forest wolves kept Tomato company. The fairies weren't hostile to the forest wolves. When they saw the forest wolves beside Tomato, they treated Tomato better than Dragonborn. The fairies were wary of the young wyvern and kept it outside Yggdrasil, though Dragonborn was able to visit the young wyvern occasionally. He had to ensure that his strange encounter treasure wasn't lost. Things changed on the 7th day. When Dragonborn finished his work for the day and was about to return to his treehouse to rest, Tomato patted his shoulder. Dragonborn looked at Tomato, who made a silent hand gesture. Then Tomato said, "Shush, don't say a word. I think we can escape tonight. They aren't on guard today." Dragonborn didn't know how Tomato knew that the fairies weren't on guard, but he trusted Tomato. Therefore, he nodded and followed Tomato's instructions. They had to remove their shackles. The fairies tied tree vines on their hands that prevented them from using mana. Dragonborn felt that he was unable to activate his mana skills. While Dragonborn was looking for something sharp to cut the vines, Tomato shrunk his hands and squirmed out of them. Was that the contorting skill? Dragonborn looked in astonishment at Tomato's feet. Tomato was nonchalant. He put Dragonborn's hands on the table and nodded before saying, "Are you ready?" Dragonborn didn't understand Tomato, but he nodded and replied, "I'm ready." Tomato raised his fist and pummeled Dragonborn's hands, and the crisp sound of bones fracturing could be heard. His hands became limp, and he was unable to control them. Dragonborn felt that his hands were fractured, but he didn't feel any pain. He understood what Tomato was doing. After his bones were fractured, his hands could get out of the vines easily. It was another contorting skill. Tomato said to Dragonborn, "Don't worry, I found a healing potion. The fairy's healing potion is the best." Tomato took out a potion and poured it on Dragonborn's hands. His 2 fractured hands healed completely. "Let's go and retrieve our weapons and armor before leaving. Follow behind me. There are few guards today, as they went to Yggdrasil for a ritual that is held once every 2 days. Follow me," Tomato explained and brought Dragonborn out of the room. Dragonborn watched as Tomato used the previous vines to pick the door's lock. The door was opened, and they walked out. Tomato was familiar with the surroundings. It was as though he was walking in his home. When they arrived at each corner, he would place a shiny object on the tip of his foot, then extend it out to see around the corner. It was like the scenes in movies. If it were real life, Tomato would definitely be a special agent. However, Tomato was only a digit in the game world. Dragonborn was full of respect for Tomato, who was like his mentor. He had only read about such feelings in newspapers. Some gamers developed feelings of like or dislike for game NPCs. He didn't expect himself to develop such feelings for an NPC. Dragonborn thought he was foolish for treating an NPC like a real person. Tomato didn't know what Dragonborn was thinking about. He led Dragonborn around the fairies' territory and evaded their patrols. Finally, he got Dragonborn out of the fairies' territory. Dragonborn turned back to look at Yggdrasil. He knew that the tree was related to the open beta. He didn't know when he would return, but he was sure the next time he returned, it would be to take over Yggdrasil. Dragonborn shook his head and tossed all thoughts of Yggdrasil out of his mind. He followed Tomato and vanished into the dense forest. Behind them, a fairy stood on a branch overlooking their departure. He turned his head and said to his companion, "Those 2 humans have left. Do we follow them?" The companion was wearing golden armor and looked nobler than the rest of the fairies. The fairy in golden armor nodded and said, "Let them leave. The human is able to build a close relationship with the wyvern, so perhaps he can help us. Follow them. If they can interact with the primordial creatures, it will be useful in our mission to find the princess." The fairy at the side nodded and followed behind Tomato and Dragonborn. Dragonborn didn't know, but Tomato discovered that someone was trailing them. After leaving the fairies' territory, he didn't let down his guard. He moved with Dragonborn and changed directions several times, using several techniques to determine their location. After an hour of fleeing, Tomato and Dragonborn arrived at a wooden house. The wooden house was built on top of the branches of a large tree and was hidden by the thick foliage. It was hard to discover unless one looked closely. The house looked aged, and the walls were covered in green moss. When Dragonborn entered the house, he found that the furniture was quite new in contrast to the aged appearance outside. Tomato leaned next to the window and looked outside before saying to Dragonborn, "I don't know whether the fairies followed us here, so we can only rest here for an hour. Don't worry about your young wyvern. It will catch up based on your scent. Of course, not now. Otherwise, the fairies will follow the young wyvern to locate you. I covered your scent with some fragrance. Once we are out of the woods, I'll remove the fragrance. Don't worry, the young wyvern's sense of smell is acute." Dragonborn believed Tomato. He didn't expect Tomato to be knowledgeable about wyverns. He had a lot to learn from Tomato. Tomato sat down and frowned. He said to Dragonborn, "The fairies are preparing for something. I don't know what they're planning, but I feel something ominous." Dragonborn's eyes lit up. It must be the sequel to his strange encounter mission. Chapter 472. These people are crazy. Dragonborn wasn't sure what conspiracy Tomato was talking about. It must be a strange encounter mission. If he followed the plot mission, he would trigger more plot developments and rewards. Tomato wasn't interested in the fairies' conspiracy. Whatever the fairies intended to do had nothing to do with him. He only wanted to leave the fairies' territory. Tomato was unable to return to his previous hideout and had to find a new place for his base. He was still a fugitive, so he couldn't go back to the Empire. After a good rest, Tomato and Dragonborn left the wooden house and went into the forest. Dragonborn thought he might not be able to go offline to sleep for a few days. They were both fleeing. If he went offline to sleep, he might get Tomato into trouble and cause the strange encounter mission to fail. Dragonborn thought that the game was really tough for his physical body. The gamers of Victoria City came out from the teleport portal at the York territory and started building their stronghold. In the castle of the Duke of York, a team of garrison guards was patrolling the surrounding territory and discovered something unusual. In the sparse woods, there were creatures who had green symbols above their heads. They used crude tools to log the trees and dig up soil. The garrison guards knew that it was abnormal and went to ask the creatures what they were doing. The creatures saw the garrison guards come over, but they didn't flee or speak. The creatures merely looked on curiously and with anticipation. The garrison guards became wary. If they were residents from the nearby villages, they would greet them and tell them what they were doing when they saw the patrol team from the Duke of York. Though it wasn't illegal to log trees, this was the private land of the Duke of York. It wasn't appropriate to cut the trees there. If the loggers were caught, they would be sent to prison. "What are you doing?" One of the garrison guards shouted at the creatures, but they didn't respond. They were chatting among themselves before electing a representative. The garrison guard found them to be very excited and heard something about strange encounters coming. "Let me try to talk to them. I'm more immersive in my role, and I'm a good performer." The representative walked to the garrison guard and said earnestly, "We're cutting down the trees to build our stronghold. Are you affiliated with the Duke of York?" The garrison guard was taken aback. "Building a stronghold? What stronghold?" The garrison guard grasped the hilt of his sword and became fierce. He looked at the gamers and asked authoritatively, "What stronghold are you building?" "This is the private land of the Duke of York. If you don't have any business here, leave immediately. If other guards find you, you'll be killed. I'm in a good mood, so I won't fight with you. If you don't leave, I'll turn nasty." The gamers chatted for a while. Then, the representative said to the garrison guard, "You look like a good person. You shouldn't be working for the evil Duke of York. Why don't you defect to Victoria City? Don't worry, no matter what problems you have, we'll help you." The garrison guard was befuddled. He unsheathed his weapon and said, "Capture them. They're from Victoria City. Bring them back for interrogation." The garrison guards were taken aback as they unsheathed their weapons and got ready for a fight. The gamers smiled. They were even a little excited as they threw their tree logging tools to the ground. An impatient gamer tied himself up and shouted to the guards, "Quick, I'm tied. Bring me back." The garrison guards thought the creatures were crazy and tied them up before bringing them back to the castle of the Duke of York. The Duke of York was bewildered when he heard about it. He had just gotten out of bed, and a guard reported to him that the Victorians had arrived at his territory. "Wait, how did they arrive?" There were no warnings, the Duke of York asked his assistant. The assistant responded calmly, "They must have disguised themselves as merchants. Recently, there were many merchant bands passing through. Don't worry, Great Duke, the spies in Goldshire Town have replied to us. There were many Victorians in Goldshire Town yesterday. They can't reach us that soon. The Victorians that appeared must be a handful of scouts to gather intelligence." "Don't worry, Great Duke." The Duke of York nodded. Since there were many Victorians at Goldshire Town, they wouldn't arrive at his castle that fast. Unless they could fly, of course. The Duke of York was relieved. He went to the prison to question those captured Victorians. The excited Victorians were tied to a wooden beam, and their bodies were full of whiplashes and burn marks. They weren't afraid or in pain. The prison wardens were unable to figure it out. The Duke was happy. Like the slave merchant said, the Victorians were like hoodlum. They didn't know fear or pain and were natural slave warriors. If he could defeat the Victorians and conscript them to be his slave warriors, he would be able to create a huge slave army. Then he could defeat all other dukes and even the king. He could envision a loyal slave army marching and cheering in front of him. His enemies and the king would fall into his hands in the future. The slaves would fight for his dreams and goals. Without fear, they would defeat all of his enemies. He would ascend the throne and get married to the princess of the neighboring country. They would have a pair of cute babies, a boy and a girl. The boy would become his successor, while his daughter would help him gain a diplomatic alliance with a neighboring country. When he had two strong allies, they would attack other countries and occupy more lands. If he was strong enough, he would collude with one of his allies to attack the other ally. When the world was left with only his country and the other ally, he could take his time to conquer the ally. At this moment, he had imagined his grand world conquest. Great Duke, Great Duke. The assistant reminded him softly, and the Duke regained awareness. He nodded as he looked at the prisoners. The prisoners had green symbols above their heads. The Duke couldn't recognize the symbols, but he knew they were from Victoria City like Hoodlum. "Are you from Victoria City?" the Duke asked even though he knew the answer. The prisoner nodded and said, "That's correct, we're from Victoria City, and you're an evil Duke." Though he was covered in injuries, the Duke ordered the prison wardens to whip him as a punishment for speaking against him. But the Duke didn't see any hatred, anger, or pain on his face. All of his previous prisoners would react strongly to his torture, which was the Duke's favorite pastime. This was just the beginning. The Duke believed he could make the slaves yield even though he didn't manage to make Hoodlum yield. "I think you're mistaken, I'm not a cruel Duke. In fact, I'm generous. I took good care of your comrade, Hoodlum, before. He had good food and drinks and gained fame. I could have provided him with tens of women and made him happy if he had requested." "Gosh, are you mad? You wanted to provide him with tens of women just to make him happy." "I wouldn't do that," another prisoner shouted and looked at the Duke as though he was a fool. The Duke was furious. He obtained a metal club and bashed it on the prisoner's leg, which was immediately fractured. The prisoner looked at his fractured leg and the metal club in the Duke's hand. Nobody knew what the prisoner was thinking. "Gosh, you're quite violent. Is it all right for the game to have such a violent NPC? Won't the game be shut down by the censorship department?" Another nearby gamer shook his body and reminded his companion, "Remember to be immersed in your role. Otherwise, our strange encounter mission will fail. Do you want to be the second Hoodlum?" The gamer with the fractured leg nodded and wailed in pain. Halfway through, he felt that his voice wasn't professional and reduced his volume. Was he a nutcase? Even if he was, it was all right. The Duke of York had encountered many crazy people. He said to the prisoners, "Good, I won't say much, I'll just tell you to be obedient. I can provide what you require if I can gain your trust. Let's build a friendly collaboration. Don't you agree?" The Duke of York showed his pleasant smile, and the gamers thought that his smile was sinister. However, they didn't tell him. As long as he provided them with strange encounter missions, the gamers were good. This was a game, unlike in reality, where people were righteous. Some gamers preferred to join the evil faction. If given the choice, the gamers didn't mind joining the Duke's faction. The Duke and his men had red names, so the gamers were unable to join them. The Duke noticed that the gamers didn't respond to his question and felt he wasn't direct enough. He said, "If you cooperate with me, I'll find the best physician to treat your wounds. I'll also confer VIP status to you. You'll obtain the most luxurious house, unlimited delicacies, a piece of land, and become a noble. How's that? Is anyone willing to provide intelligence on Victoria City?" The gamers immediately started shouting, "Yes, yes, yes. Let me tell you. Give me this strange encounter mission, please. Please, Daddy, give me the chance." The Duke of York could only make out a few words in the din. He didn't obtain any useful information. He felt that the chattering prisoners were insulting him instead of begging him. "Enough." The Duke slammed down on the table and looked at the gamers as he said, "If you don't cooperate and continue to fool around, I'll kill all of you." A gamer quickly said, "Great Duke, don't be angry. My companions are slow-witted. I'm willing to cooperate with you. I'll tell you information about Victoria City. They're building a stronghold outside our castle." Another gamer smiled and said, "Oh my God, aren't you impatient? Is the castle ours? If I upload your conversation to the discussion forum, everyone will laugh at you." Another gamer said, "I'm already laughing to death. You're such a weasel. I have to make a complaint against you. You won't be able to survive in Victoria City." The face of the Duke became dark with anger. Why were the Victorians building a stronghold outside his castle? How could that be? The prisoner had to be fooling him. He was furious. He controlled his temper and said to the gamers, "Tell me more details. How many Victorians are there? How many Victorians have arrived?" The gamer replied, "Great Duke, we have 5,000 gamers or Victorians. They come here daily to build the stronghold outside your castle. I can provide you the location." The Duke of York could no longer take it. He took a longsword from his guard and stabbed the gamer to death. The other gamers looked bewildered at the Duke, who was wiping the bloodstains off his face. Then the Duke said viciously, "This is the result of deceiving me. Don't treat me like a fool. If you deceive me again, I'll kill all of you." He threw the weapon to the ground and asked angrily, "How many of you have come to my castle?" Another gamer said, 5,000. "I can guarantee that 5,000 warriors will appear at your castle during the battle. You'll be dead. If you believe me and release me, I'll recruit warriors for you on the discussion forum. Half of them will be willing to join you if you provide enough equipment and land." The Duke took another weapon and stabbed the gamer to death. Were they treating him like a fool? The 5,000 Victorians were at Goldshire Town yesterday, so how could they arrive so fast? The Duke wouldn't tell that to the gamers. After killing the previous gamer, he looked at the third gamer and said, "Tell me how many of you are here. If you deceive me, I'll kill you. No, you'll be in a worse state." The third gamer lowered his head and thought for a while, then lifted his head and said to the Duke of York seriously, "Great Duke, do you want to listen to the truth or lies?" The Duke said, "I want the truth." The gamer replied, "The truth is that tens of us are in the forest. Nobody will attack your castle. Those two guys were fooling you." The Duke of York nodded. Finally, there was an honest guy. He asked, "When do you intend to attack us? Do you have any detailed battle plans? Why are you here?" The gamer pondered and said, "Great Duke, we came here to carry out Queen Victoria's order to build a stronghold and gather intelligence about the weaknesses of the castle. We don't wish to work for that poor Queen Victoria. We want to work for you. We are defecting." The gamer spoke earnestly. The few surviving gamers immediately shouted, "Yes, yes. We are defecting." The Duke pondered for a while and said to his assistant, "Keep this man for interrogation, and imprison the rest. If anyone wants to cooperate, record their statements. I'll hand them to you. I don't care about their life and death. The important thing is to capture all of the Victorians in the forest. Do you understand?" The assistant nodded and said, "I understand." The two stabbed gamers who were tied to the wooden beam slowly disintegrated into mana and vanished. The Duke of York was given a fright. He hadn't seen anyone transforming into mana after death. Nobody had seen such a situation before. They thought that anything was possible with a Victorian. Perhaps the Victorians were like the legendary race that was blessed by the gods. The Duke of York decided to capture them and use them as his tools for world conquest. He left the prison with a heart full of ambition. The York territory was only his stepping stone for his ambition, while Victoria City was his second step. Thus, he had to defeat Victoria City. That was what the Duke of York thought. The few prisoners slept simultaneously. The prison wardens thought that the prisoners had fallen asleep. The prison wardens hadn't been insulted before. They whipped the prisoners viciously, but there were no responses. It was just like hoodlum. When the gamers went offline, the first thing they did was inform everyone on the discussion forum about joining the York territory. If the gamers defected voluntarily, they could become the Duke's men. That was the Duke's intention. Everyone knew about Hoodlum's strange encounter mission. He became a slave after being imprisoned and was then trained. Perhaps the gamers could be trained after being imprisoned and trigger a new hidden faction. It was exhilarating to join the York territory. There were free rides, armor, houses, food, and female servants. It was like attaining the pinnacle of life. The gamers of Victoria City were excited. They arrived at the forest via the teleport portal in a rush and looked for the patrol teams. The entire forest was soon filled with gamers. The guards who were supposed to capture the Victorians were given a fright, and they fled back to the Duke's castle, reporting what they saw to the Duke of York. The Duke of York had returned from the prison and was in a room sipping his tea while listening to the reports. After listening to the astonishing report, he spat out tea on the guard's face. Then he asked loudly, "What did you say? Repeat it." The guard replied, "Great Duke, the Victorians are all in the forest outside the castle." The Duke of York didn't believe it. He left the room and walked to the balcony, observing the black mass of people in the forest. He estimated that there were a few thousand of them. Did the two prisoners who died tell the truth? And the prisoner whom he thought was telling the truth was actually lying? However, his intelligence report told him a different story. Were the Victorians not in Goldshire Town? How did they arrive so fast? Did they fly? The Duke of York couldn't figure it out. He looked at the report in his hands that was sent from Goldshire Town 3 days ago. It stated that there were 3,000 to 4,000 Victorians at Goldshire Town. The Duke of York thought that his intelligence system was perfect and that the information was accurate. However, he was wrong. The Victorians were standing below and in front of his castle. How could that be wrong? He ordered the guards loudly, "Rush those counts who are providing reinforcements. Shut the castle door. Don't let them in." The Duke went back to the prison and took a weapon. He then hacked the sleeping prisoner that provided false information to death. When the killed gamer went online and found himself at the revival point, he was very surprised. The gamers formed groups and arrived at the castle. They shouted, "Let us come in. We're defecting. Capture us quickly." The gamers were getting impatient. Not all of the gamers were shouting to defect. Some gamers tried to climb the walls. The guards at the parapet looked at the Victorians' behavior, and they all had the same thought: were these people insane? Chapter 473, Rescue Team. The gamers didn't attack. Instead, they tried to sneak into the prison to lock themselves up. That was a good thing, as the guards of the castle weren't attacked. The gamers were busy defecting and sneaking into the castle in a bid to become famous slave warriors. Who had the time to attack the castle? The few gamers who wanted to attack the castle were unable to break the defenses and cause any harm. The gamers of Victoria City tried all sorts of ways to sneak into the castle to defect, even at night. The gamers who got into the castle weren't released. The Duke was reluctant to kill these gamers since they were fearless warriors. Where could he find such warriors? The gamers were locked in cells. Recently, more and more gamers climbed over the walls, swam through the moat, and disguised themselves as commoners in a bid to get into the castle. Within a week, the prison cells of the castle were flooded with Victorians. There were about 500 to 600 Victorians locked up in prison, and the number was increasing. The gamers got to know more methods to get into the castle on the discussion forum. A gamer made use of the night to sneak into the prison. It was a wonder how the gamer knew the location of the prison. The next morning, the prison wardens got a fright when they noticed an extra prisoner. They tried to confirm whether the extra prisoner was previously captured or just recently captured. However, none of the prison wardens had seen the extra prisoner before. It was as though he suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The extra prisoner said, "Please lock me up. I'm willing to be your slave. Let me fight for you, even if I have to do it for a lifetime." The prison wardens didn't expect such a thing to happen. They had no choice but to lock him up in the prison cell. More and more gamers of Victoria City appeared in the prison cells. They even disguised themselves as female servants and other staff members in the Duke's castle so that they could be captured by the castle guards. On the 10th day, the small prison cells that could accommodate only 300 prisoners had 1,000 gamers all crammed together. The prison guards suggested that the Duke kill some of the prisoners. Otherwise, the prison might become a dangerous place. The Duke wanted to fulfill his goals, so he was reluctant to kill these excellent warriors. The gamers developed a strange relationship with the Duke of York. One Queen Victoria got to know about it. She frowned and asked the three hamsters, "What are the gamers doing? Are they betraying Victoria City?" Big Boss Hamster quickly replied, "No, my lady. I feel it's one of their schemes. They have successfully infiltrated the castle, and when we give the order, they can attack from within." Second Boss Hamster said, "That's correct. That's what I think too. That's a brilliant scheme. As long as we can take over the castle, I can accept any of their schemes." Fat Otaku said, "Can we have our meal?" Lilo nodded her head. "What you've said makes sense. Let them infiltrate the castle. When the time is ripe, we'll take it over," Lilo said to the three hamsters. Lancelot wasn't sure what the gamers were up to when they tried to sneak into the castle. He thought they were infiltrating the castle to attack the Duke. However, he got to know from the gamers that they were defecting. As a knight, it was inconceivable to defect. These gamers were definitely not normal. They weren't defecting due to fear. What were the gamers thinking? Were they planning to attack the castle from within? From Lancelot's observation for the past few days, the gamers weren't planning to attack the castle from within. Instead, they were defecting to the Duke. It was a serious case of treason, so he informed Queen Lilo, but she was nonchalant. She told Lancelot that the gamers would never betray her and should never betray her. Lancelot thought that the Queen had a hold over the gamers. From his memories, every time Lilo appeared, the restless gamers would become obedient. They wouldn't say a word or make any moves. Instead, they would watch the queen closely. Lancelot had other problems, such as setting up the defenses of the stronghold. Due to the mass defection of the gamers, the Duke knew about the stronghold's location and sent scouts to conduct surveillance. Once the Duke discovered the stronghold, he would want to destroy it. Fortunately, Lancelot chose a strategic location. The surrounding sides were protected by high terrain, and there was only a single entrance. It was difficult for the castle guards to mount an effective attack against the stronghold. Moreover, the number of castle guards was inferior to the number of gamers. Even if 1,000 of the gamers were imprisoned, there were still 3,000 gamers at the stronghold. The Duke's scouts conducted surveillance of the stronghold and never came back. Occasionally, some guards came to keep watch on the stronghold to prevent any surprise attacks. Lancelot knew that the Duke didn't have the capability to attack, but he didn't let down his guard. The counts were on their way to reinforce the Duke of York and could arrive anytime. Once the counts arrived with their reinforcements, the gamers of Victoria City would lose their numerical superiority. Though the gamers wouldn't be defeated, they would have to spend a lot more effort to take over the castle. That wasn't what Lancelot wanted. Lancelot tried to persuade the queen to attack the castle immediately, but she wasn't in a hurry. She wanted to see what the gamers were up to. He could only fulfill his responsibility as a subordinate. He ordered the gamers to build siege weapons. The gamers had a new daily mission to build siege weapons, but they were indifferent to the additional daily mission. The Duke was extremely happy. He thought he was doomed when he saw his castle being sieged by the great number of Victorians. He even thought of fleeing his castle. However, he didn't expect the Victorians to defect to him en masse. The Duke was overjoyed when he heard that the counts bringing reinforcements had arrived at the boundary of the York territory. The plains at the boundary of the York territory were filled tents, knights, and their squires who were busy preparing meals. The counts were resting in the tents. Their responsibilities included governing their lands, enjoying life, and fighting for their lord during wartime. Fighting a battle was dangerous, so the noble counts tried to enjoy themselves as much as possible. There were 5 counts that came to reinforce the Duke. The most capable count was called Steamed Dumpling, and he was the leader of the reinforcements. Before they entered the York territory, they held a war conference. "I believe that all of you are aware that there are 5,000 enemies sieging the Duke's castle," Steamed Dumpling said. Another count asked, "I heard they were only farmers without complete equipment. How are the farmers a threat to us?" Another count smiled and said, "These farmers are sieging our respectable Duke in his castle. It seems like the Duke is too kind-hearted towards the farmers." All of the counts laughed, as they knew that the Duke wasn't kind-hearted. The Duke was besieged because his 3,000 knights were killed by the farmers. This was a piece of astonishing news. The Duke wanted to have a strong reason to attack Victoria City, so he spread the news of his humiliation. After attacking Victoria City, his knights were annihilated. Only a handful of survivors returned to the Duke of York. This was a piece of incredible news. After the initial shock, they laughed at the previously domineering Duke. Due to his defeat, the Duke's reputation was badly tarnished. Even his subordinate counts were in contempt of the Duke. However, they had to fulfill their responsibilities as subordinates. Steamed Dumpling tapped the table lightly and said, "Gentlemen, you must be thinking that the warriors of Victoria City are weak. Don't forget that these weaklings defeated 3,000 knights of the Duke. I'm sure you know how strong the Duke's knights were. Don't underestimate the enemy, as they aren't as simple as we thought." The other counts became solemn. They had become too complacent. As Steamed Dumpling was about to discuss their war plans in detail, a scout ran hurriedly into the tent and said, "Great counts, the warriors of Victoria City are closing in on our camp." The counts and barons broke into a loud discussion in the tents. They couldn't believe it. They furiously discussed it at length. They felt it was an insult that the farmers of Victoria City dared to launch an attack. Steamed Dumpling ordered the counts and barons to lead their armies and fight against the Victorians. When they deployed their formation outside their tents, they discovered that there were only 100 Victorians, and they weren't in formation. They weren't on horses, wore no clothes, and held inferior clubs. They didn't look like scouts. Perhaps they were emissaries? The counts and barons didn't order an attack, as they were confused. The Victorians stopped at a distance of 3 minutes of horse riding from the camp. The Victorians pointed at the camp and chatted, but it was too far to make out what they were saying. Steamed Dumpling was getting impatient when the Victorians stood their ground. He ordered his squire to ride towards the 100-strong group of enemies with his flag. The gamers became excited when they saw a squire on horseback coming towards them. The counts thought the farmers of Victoria City were fearful. I feel that the prowess of the farmers from Victoria City was overrated. They became fearful after seeing our camp. When the battle starts, they'll surely flee. I can't imagine why the Duke was besieged and requested our help. He must have been complacent, a baron commented condescendingly, and the other barons laughed. The 100 gamers rushed towards the squire and knocked him unconscious. Then, they stripped his clothing and stole his horse. After a discussion, one of the gamers rode the horse and left happily. How could the counts endure such humiliation? They rode out with their horses. Soon, 400 to 500 horsemen dashed towards the gamers. The gamers saw the approaching horsemen and panicked. They started to flee from the cavalry. How could the gamers outrun the cavalry? The horsemen swung their weapons and massacred the gamers who were cursing, swearing in anger, and laughing. They didn't hear any gamers beg for mercy. Just like what they heard in the legends, the gamers had no intention to surrender. Steamed Dumpling was deeply shocked and became silent. He had never encountered warriors with such superior willpower. There were only 100 enemies. He could imagine how terrifying it would be to fight against 5,000 of them. He realized that the legendary Victorians weren't overrated. Steamed Dumpling trembled, not in fear but in anticipation of an impending vicious battle. He had a strong desire to defeat such a worthy opponent. Steamed Dumpling turned his horse around and shouted to his counts and barons, "Prepare yourselves, we'll launch an attack on Victoria's stronghold. We can't let them besiege the Duke's castle. We have to diminish their arrogance." Everyone roared with excitement, and a large group of horsemen set off from the camp towards Victoria's stronghold. The massacred gamers appeared at the revival point. They cursed and swore, then spread the news of new horsemen arriving at the boundary of the Duke's castle and attacking them. However, the gamers didn't mention their deeds of robbing the squire's armor and horse. To them, it was their normal affairs. What was there to talk about? Chapter 474. Start of Battle. At Victoria's stronghold in the York territory, the gamers were informing each other of the new knights that appeared at the boundary of the Duke's castle and an impending attack. They had to prepare their defenses. The gamers were used to being attacked, having been attacked several times since the start of Victoria City. After every attack, the gamers would have a bounty, so they welcomed the attacks. The knights were going to attack them, so they were extremely happy. Lancelot was nervous as he directed the gamers to build up the defenses, such as chevaux de frise and obstacles at the only way into the stronghold. Lancelot was still worried, but there were no other choices. The troops of the counts and barons got close to Victoria's stronghold. When thousands of knights surrounded the stronghold, many gamers were wandering outside, and they were captured by the knights. They were easily captured. After all, the gamers had no intention to flee. The gamers thought that the knights were ordered to capture them by the Duke, so they offered to be captured. If they joined the slave warrior army, they could be like Hoodlum and be at their life's pinnacle. Why would they want to flee? The gamers didn't know that the knights were the reinforcements of the counts and barons, who didn't have the intention to form a slave army to conquer the world. To rescue the Duke, they tried their best to diminish the combat power of the gamers. After capturing and interrogating the surrendered gamers, they killed all of the prisoners. The counts didn't have any prisons to keep the gamers, especially when there were thousands of them. Even if there were only hundreds of them, the counts wouldn't hesitate to kill them. The gamers got to know on the discussion forum and from the other gamers that defecting to these knights would only invite instant death instead of strange encounter missions. Since there was no mission, the gamers started attacking the counts' army. The ambitious Steamed Dumpling felt the same hopelessness that George had. When the battle began, Steamed Dumpling's soldiers held the upper hand and almost overran the stronghold. The chevaux de frise and obstacles were cleared. Then he used fire and burned all of the obstacles. The gamers outside were captured and killed before they launched an attack at the stronghold. Count Steamed Dumpling. As the troops were about to attack, a knight walked to Steamed Dumpling and said, "The location of the Victoria camp is strategic. I thought the Victorians were only brave and brutish. I didn't expect them to have such a tactical genius. I'm surprised too. However, this defensive stronghold isn't a problem for us. Steamed Dumpling smiled confidently and said to the troops behind him, "Bring forth our cannons." A few squires pushed 3 large cannons forward. The gamers in the stronghold noticed the large cannons. They never expected such a weapon to exist in the medieval ages. However, it was nothing strange for such a thing to occur in a game. The cannons used by Count Steamed Dumpling weren't simple cannons using gunpowder. They were similar to the Underworld magic cannons. The energy used wasn't mana but the power of knowledge. In other words, it was the power of sacred light. The energy for the cannon shell wasn't derived from a gunpowder explosion. Instead, there was a propulsion device attached at the back of the cannon. Before firing, the device had to be filled with water, and a shell that was filled with the power of sacred light was loaded into the cannon. Only members of the church knew the details of the cannons. Steamed Dumpling wasn't a member of the church, and he wasn't interested in the mechanisms of the sacred light cannon shell. He was only interested in using it. Steam energy didn't provide much power, so a member of the church blessed the cannons with sacred light. He chanted and engulfed the 3 cannons in the sacred light. The gamers were shocked. They didn't expect that the power of sacred light could be used this way. With the order of Steamed Dumpling, the 3 cannons fired simultaneously. The brilliant shells flew towards Victoria's stronghold and exploded in midair. The explosion was blinding and destroyed everything in the stronghold. The wooden defenses were completely destroyed by the second volley of the cannons. The first volley destroyed most of the stronghold. Only the rune mana formation that was protected by mana was intact. The rune mana formation was more than enough for the gamers to turn the tide. At Victoria City, Lancelot had just come out from the castle when he felt something strange in the atmosphere. A lot of naked gamers came out of the revival point, cursing and swearing. "What's the deal? The cannons killed all of us. Isn't this an online game? Why is it a plot-driven massacre?" It was horrifying. I didn't have a chance to react before I died. "Make haste. Let's go back and check our equipment. It should still be around since we were killed during a plot. If I lose my equipment, I'll kill the game producer's mom." The gamers were making a fuss. They then ran towards the teleport portal. Lancelot didn't have to ask to know that something happened at the stronghold in the York territory. As he was about to enter the teleport portal, Big Boss Hamster stopped him and said, "Count Glamorgan, please don't leave. The Queen ordered us not to enter the York territory. But our stronghold is being attacked. I have to direct their defenses. If the enemy enters the teleport portal, even the Queen will be in danger." Big Boss smiled and said, "That's impossible. Even if they arrive here, they are of no threat to the Queen. Just heed the order of the Queen and stay in Victoria City. This is for your safety." Big Boss Hamster didn't explain much. Lancelot speculated that the Queen believed in the revival ability of the gamers. They didn't have to fear the enemy. As a knight, he was always hiding when there was danger. It was difficult for him to accept. He wanted to rebuke and obtain a chance to fight at the front line. Big Boss didn't give him a chance and went back into the castle. As Lancelot was about to catch up with Big Boss, he saw Guinevere, who said, "Count Lancelot, I heard the stronghold in the York territory was attacked. Did the Duke counterattack?" Seeing Guinevere's worried expression, Lancelot quickly explained, "Don't worry. The situation isn't clear. Believe in our strength. We'll help you get back your land, Miss Guinevere." As he spoke, Lancelot straightened his back like a real knight. "Apologies, I'm not Miss Guinevere. I told you before that I'm not a woman." Guinevere was embarrassed, but Lancelot nodded with understanding. If Guinevere's territory was being usurped and she was forced to flee, she would disguise herself as a man. It would be easier for her. It was unknown when Lancelot began to believe that Guinevere was a woman and disregarded other people's perceptions of Guinevere. Guinevere was now his wife, and the Queen was his master. The Queen betrothed Guinevere to him, and the order couldn't be rescinded. Though Lancelot nodded, Guinevere didn't think that Lancelot had accepted his explanation. Guinevere tried to explain many times, but Lancelot still thought of him as a woman. However, it wasn't the time to fret over it. He asked Lancelot, "If you require my help to fight at the stronghold, please tell me. Don't look at me like that. I can wield weapons and ride a horse to battle." Lancelot was about to say something when a gamer interrupted them and said, "Do you want to take a look at the battlefield? I can be your guard. Give the mission to me." A gamer volunteered himself while other gamers had just recovered from their shock. They didn't know that a strange encounter mission could be obtained from a plot. Was that not a hidden mission? If a gamer could receive a generous reward from escorting Guinevere around the battlefield, it would be an easy mission. Choose me. The Hoodlum Yoga Association is the strongest guild in Victoria City. I'm stronger, my weapon level is level 5. Give me the chance. Guinevere, I respect you a lot. Let me be your escorting knight. I'll protect you. Even if I die a million times, I'll not let any harm come to you. Are you becoming unscrupulous because of a strange encounter mission? Are you ditching your integrity? Lancelot didn't have a chance to speak to Guinevere, who was uncomfortable with the game's offers. Guinevere raised his hand nervously in a bid to decline their offers. The commotion attracted even more gamers. At that moment, a gamer at the teleport portal shouted, "My equipment is gone. All destroyed by 2 volleys of cannon fire. Give me back my equipment, you trashy game. Isn't that a safety zone? There's no safety zone when monsters attack. Even the queen can be killed. Go and help at the stronghold. The knights are attacking." More and more gamers entered the teleport portal to help defend the stronghold at the York territory. Guinevere was moved when he saw the gamers fight fervently to help him regain his territory. His eyes started to well up. Lancelot noticed Guinevere's tears. He unsheathed his longsword and said to Guinevere, "Don't worry, we'll help you get back the York territory." "Thank you, Count Glamorgan." Guinevere was touched as he looked at Lancelot. Then, he said to the gamers, "Thank you, everyone. Thank you for helping me regain the York territory. I'll reward everyone who has shed their blood and life. Your names will be remembered by all in the York territory." Guinevere's voice became louder. The gamers were full of anticipation for the generous rewards. They became very excited and dashed to the teleport portal to battle the enemy knights. The battle between the Duke of York and Victoria City had just started. Chapter 475. I want to join you. Steamed Dumpling, who was wearing white armor and a red cloak, was riding on his strong warhorse. From his appearance, Steamed Dumpling looked like a knight from a painting. He looked on with satisfaction at the stronghold that was flattened by his 3 cannons. Previously, it was filled with many Victorians, but now, even the flesh was vaporized. Only their metal armor and weapons were left damaged on the ground. Steamed Dumpling was puzzled. Even if the firepower of the cannons was enormous, shouldn't there be some corpses left? Steamed Dumpling thought it was a new kind of a cannon. The stronghold was destroyed, but he ordered his men to perform a search to see if there were any survivors. Steamed Dumpling couldn't afford to fire more cannon volleys. After all, the cannon shells were endowed with special sacred light. Normal cannons' shells weren't that powerful. After considering the strong willpower of the Victorians, Steamed Dumpling borrowed the 3 powerful cannons to reduce his casualties. It was a wise decision on his part. The squires walked towards Victoria's stronghold, while the knights stationed themselves on the high ground at the boundary of the stronghold. They chatted happily as they looked down at the empty camp. When they let down their guard and were about to return to the Duke's castle, they saw a strange rune mana formation emitting magical brilliance. Then, many naked humans, elves, and fairies walked out of the rune mana formation. They had green symbols above their heads and looked surprised at the squires. They then charged viciously at the squires empty-handed. George stood on the parapet of the Duke's castle and observed the battle at the distant stronghold. Ever since the warriors of Victoria City arrived at the Duke's castle, he would stand on the parapet and observe them. He was attacked and besieged by the warriors before. As an experienced knight, he was unable to accept the fact that he was utterly defeated by these forest barbarians. He was contemplating the battle tactics of the Victorians. He discovered with shock that the Victorians used tactics like sacrificing themselves, delaying battle, and reinforcements to achieve victory over his powerful knights that had superior equipment. The Victorians did a good job of attriting his 3,000 knights. He didn't know the strength of the Count's army, but from his observation, there were at least 5,000 knights. Though the Counts had a sizable army, George didn't think that they could defeat the terrifying Victorians. The enemies were like endless fleas. No matter how he killed them, there would be new warriors to replace the dead. He had encountered that before. The Counts had 3 cannons that vaporized all of the Victorians. George was in awe of the powerful cannons. When he saw all of the warriors of Victoria City vanishing in an instant, he thought that maybe the Counts could really defeat the Victorians after all. Things turned out as George had expected. Unlimited warriors of Victoria City emerged from the Rune Mana formation in the stronghold. The Rune Mana formation was a teleport portal that only a great magician could create. George had gained new insights into the capabilities of the Victorians as more and more warriors emerged from the teleport portal. They were unleashing their endless waves of warriors again. George became grave. He knew what the ending would be. The Duke was happily sipping red grape wine in his room. The grape wine was produced in the king's hinterland, and its rich flavor pervaded his mouth. The Duke of York felt he was on top of the world at this moment. 1,000 citizens of Victoria City had become his slave warriors. At the same time, the counts had brought reinforcements and decimated the enemy stronghold. There was no more threat to his rule. After clearing the enemy stronghold, he was going to train the 1,000 slaves in the prison. They didn't have to participate in the underground slave gladiator fights. He wanted to use these 1,000 slaves to occupy Victoria City and enslave all of the residents. Then he could raise a slave army to attack the king and conquer the world. The Duke imagined his future feats as he drank his red grape wine. He couldn't resist humming a tune. Great Duke, bad news. A long-robed servant shouted in the corridor before he arrived at the door. What's the matter? Why are you so nervous? The Duke stood up and walked to the door as he asked, "Are the Victorians attacking us again?" The Duke of York thought of this possibility in fear. Every time he heard about Victoria City, he would feel terror. The warriors of Victoria City had defeated his best 3,000 knights and arrived at lightning speed at his castle. He didn't know how they did that. No, Victoria's stronghold was destroyed, and they did not come back, the servant said as he panted heavily. Why are you so nervous? Are there any other important things to report? The servant almost cried out as he said, the Victorians in the prison started a rebellion. What? The Duke almost jumped up. His vision turned black, and he fell to the ground. In the prison of the castle, Take Spearhead was half naked. He wore the slaves' short pants and black leg fetters. The heavy fetters made his movements sluggish. Many gamers were dashing out of the prison. They were excited and howled loudly as they pillaged anything that they saw. The most important items were the equipment of the prison wardens. Take Spearhead saw the gamers remove everything with haste. He regretted that he was late getting online. He went online immediately upon reading the post on the discussion forum. When he opened his eyes, the valuable items in the prison were all pillaged by the gamers. Only the worthless items were left. Even the torture tools were missing. The content of the post on the discussion forum was, I have stayed in prison for 5 days without any rewards. I am starting a rebellion. The post was about a gamer who stayed in the castle prison for 5 days without obtaining any strange encounter mission. He had to endure beatings and hunger. The meager food was only able to sustain him, and the resting place was extremely dirty. As a gamer of Victoria City, he didn't have any special requirements for food and lodging. What he couldn't stand was wasting time. He had to endure beatings and sleeping. It was no longer fun. He was yearning for the expensive armor and sharp weapons of the prison wardens. The prison wardens also had great food in front of the prisoners. How could the gamers endure such temptation? They were getting impatient. Few gamers could stand being locked up for 5 days. After being imprisoned for a few days without any rewards, the gamers broke down. Instead of waiting, they decided to rebel and pillage the castle. Would that not be exhilarating? There were 1,000 of them in the prison, so not everyone could have a strange encounter mission. It was better to pillage than to wait for the strange encounter mission. The gamers started pillaging immediately. It was very easy for 1,000 gamers to rebel and flee. When they were dragged out to be beaten, they rushed towards the prison wardens and took over the prison. They carried out their rebellion and pillage plans. When Take Spearhead saw the news on the discussion forum and went online, it was already too late. The valuable items in the prison were removed by the gamers. It was all right, as the castle was huge. There would be other guards outside the prison, and they had comparable equipment to the prison wardens. Perhaps the Duke would have a treasure vault too. Take Spearhead had to hurry. The 1,000 gamers ran amok in the castle since there were no guards. There were only ordinary servants. The gamers ran around and pillaged the castle. The wealth accumulated by the Duke over the years had fallen prey to the gamers. While the gamers were pillaging, the Duke of York, who was protected by a small number of guards, intended to escape via a secret tunnel. How could he escape when 1,000 gamers were running around every corner of the castle? He would be instantly discovered if he made a move. The Duke had just left his room when he was captured by the pillaging gamers. Though the gamers hadn't seen the Duke before, they observed that he was protected by many guards. Moreover, he was wearing luxurious clothes and looked noble. He had to be the Duke. Fortunately, the gamers who captured the Duke were from the Hoodlum Yoga Association and not unaffiliated gamers. Otherwise, the Duke would have been stabbed to death before being stripped of all items. The guild members informed other members that the Duke was captured. Hoodlum knew that the Duke was very wealthy. How could he kill him off that easily? It has been a long time since we met, Great Duke. Hoodlum rushed over and saw the Duke being tied up. The Duke of York recognized Hoodlum immediately. He felt fearful, as he knew how he ill-treated Hoodlum with daily beatings and inhumane training. Each gladiator fight almost took Hoodlum's life. If Hoodlum was sane, he would be vengeful. Now that the Duke was in Hoodlum's hands, he could imagine dying a painful death. It was something he had never thought about before. "Please, Hoodlum, don't kill me. I'll give you everything," the Duke begged Hoodlum, disregarding his noble status and ego. Survival was of utmost importance. "Great Duke, don't worry, I'm not going to kill you." Hoodlum bent his body and walked to the Duke. He didn't feel disdain or hatred as he said, "I'm grateful to the Duke for taking care of me. I tried to return to you, but I didn't have the chance." "Don't worry, I'm finally back." Hoodlum spoke happily. "Hoodlum, don't joke with me. I'll agree with all your requests," the Duke said quickly. Hoodlum held the Duke's hand and said, "Great Duke, don't say that. I was in your care." The fat body of the Duke trembled, and he was almost in tears. Since Hoodlum said that, he was certain that he was going to die. The Duke was preparing his last words when he saw Hoodlum wave his hand and shout, "Brothers, we'll break out of the castle. If we can leave this dangerous place with the Duke, we might be able to join his faction. All the strange encounter missions will only be available to the members of the Hoodlum Yoga Association." The gamers at the side cheered. They weren't righteous gamers. As long as there were benefits, they were willing to do it. Humans were always practical. However, the interests of other gamers were at risk. The other gamers also wanted to capture the Duke and reinstate Guinevere as the new Duke. Then they could obtain rewards from Guinevere. The Hoodlum Yoga Association's intention of fleeing with the Duke to join his faction was made known to other gamers. The escape route of the Hoodlum Yoga Association was revealed on the discussion forum, and all of the other gamers moved towards the location. Fortunately, the Hoodlum Yoga Association was strong and had a large number of members. Otherwise, it would have been decimated by the unaffiliated gamers and other guild members. However, the Hoodlum Yoga Association was unable to cope with losing its members. Every time its guild members revived after being killed, they would be detained by the other gamers who accused the Hoodlum Yoga Association of looking after their own self-interest. Other gamers had wanted to join the Hoodlum Yoga Association and help the Duke of York, but the Hoodlum Yoga Association's capacity was full. The guild couldn't allow more gamers to join. A small number of gamers confessed their intention to join the Duke of York's faction, but they were a minority. Most of the gamers wanted to help Guinevere. Lancelot was in disbelief that there were traitors amongst the gamers. He informed Queen Victoria immediately. The Queen pondered for a while before letting him wait outside. Then Big Boss Hamster came out and said to Lancelot, "The citizens of Victoria City aren't defecting, and they can't defect." This is the Queen's reply. "Don't worry, and don't think too much." That was a simple reply from the Queen. It was only a side distraction from attacking the York territory. The Duke of York was unable to escape since many gamers were going to capture him. The fate of the Duke was sealed, but the Counts were fighting frantically for their lives. They experienced the terrifying aspects of the Victorians and attempted to flee. Chapter 476. Victoria City is cool. Steamed Dumpling rode on his horse and shouted frantically to rally his troops. Still, his knights descended into chaos when the unlimited warriors of Victoria City charged out from the teleport portal, the castle, and the forest. Nobody knew where the warriors of Victoria City would come from. They were like ghosts. The stronghold that was destroyed by his 3 cannons was like a trap that ensnared Steamed Dumpling and his knights. He wanted to lead his knights to escape, but the knights dwindled rapidly. Finally, he abandoned his plan and rode his horse towards the boundary of the York territory in a bid to escape. The gamers of Victoria City didn't let him escape. They rode horses that belonged to his knights to pursue him. They screamed as they pursued Steamed Dumpling, gazing intensely at Steamed Dumpling's armor, weapon, and his white warhorse. From their vicious looks, Steamed Dumpling was sure he would have a horrible death if he was caught. While he was fleeing, he saw a golden-haired horseman near the castle gate. He recognized the knight of the Duke. George was the most notable knight in the dukedom, and he was being pursued by the Victorians. The Victorians were terrifying. Not long ago, Steamed Dumpling thought about defeating the Victorians. But now, he had become pathetic. Steamed Dumpling had no time to fret. He had to escape. He rode his fast horse and galloped into the distance. The York territory was finally occupied by the gamers. The guild members of the Hoodlum Yoga Association tried their best to escort the Duke of York to another location so that he could start all over again. However, the guild lost to the teleport portal and the revival mana formation. The unaffiliated gamers controlled the revival point, detaining the members of the Hoodlum Yoga Association that revived. Hence, the members of the Hoodlum Yoga Association dwindled after fighting. That was the reason the gamers were unable to betray Victoria City. The Duke couldn't provide a revival point for them, but Victoria City had a revival point. It was a good try. The gamers tried to see if they could join the NPC faction, and it was possible. If Hoodlum and his members were able to flee with the Duke and became his subordinates, they could possibly obtain certain benefits. Even if they couldn't join the faction, they could operate as mercenaries to help a certain noble and obtain rewards. That was what the gamers learned from the current plot. The guilds were thinking about how they could work for the various noble factions. The Duke of York was sentenced to death by Queen Victoria. Under the supervision of the gamers, Lancelot gave the Duke of York a push, and he was hanged from a crooked tree. It was an honorable death since a knight mete out the punishment. Guinevere became the new Duke of York. Whether the other counts and barons were willing to recognize Guinevere as the Duke of York would depend on future diplomacy. Guinevere was from the blood lineage of the Lyons clan, and he was the successor to the York territory. The previous Duke of York usurped his dukedom for many years. Now, Guinevere had taken back what he deserved. Things weren't simple. As the new Duke of York, he had a master, Queen Victoria. According to the laws of Ascension, Guinevere was the wife of Lancelot, otherwise known as Count Glamorgan, and also a subordinate of Queen Victoria. After Guinevere became the Duke of York, the York territory became a fief of Victoria City. That was how the nobles in the medieval ages made use of marriages to consolidate land. If a subject were to marry a princess and then resort to assassinations to kill off all of the successors to the throne, he could become a king. The York territory was previously a fief of the godly kingdom that was ruled by King Potato II. But now, the York territory was a fief of Victoria City. King Potato II couldn't take it lying down. He was very furious and gathered all of his ministers, announcing this matter during his court meeting. "You are all trash. Why didn't anyone inform me about the invasion of the York territory? Now, the York territory has been conquered by Victoria City, a place that was unheard of previously. That king, no, Queen Victoria, was she ordained during a coronation by a bishop?" King Potato II was trying to find the weaknesses of Queen Victoria's identity, but a minister replied, "A bishop ordained the coronation. It was Grand Priest Baldhead, who was previously the church bishop." "What, Grand Priest Baldhead? I've heard of him before. He is a devout believer of the Holy Lord and Sacred Light. Who is this Queen Victoria that Grand Priest Baldhead ordained?" The ministers shouted out in astonishment. Grand Priest Baldhead was a noble, but King Potato II wasn't interested in the Grand Priest that ordained the coronation for Queen Victoria. He was only interested in getting back the York territory. "What shall we do? Come up with a good plan," King Potato II asked his ministers. A minister immediately replied, "Your Highness, I have a good plan. I knew the father of Duke Guinevere. I can write a letter to Guinevere to persuade him to defect to us. I'm sure he will know who is stronger and defect to us." The other ministers nodded. Compared to the godly kingdom, Victoria City was far inferior. It was only the size of a small forest that could only accommodate tens of thousands of citizens. Victoria City made use of sneak attacks to occupy a dukedom and had the law on their side. As long as Guinevere defected to King Potato II, the law would be on the side of the godly kingdom. With the approval of other ministers, King Potato II nodded and ordered the minister to write a letter to Guinevere. On the third day after the gamers occupied the Duke's castle, the king's letter arrived. Guinevere received the letter and read it. A person who was a good friend of his father persuaded him to defect to King Potato II and surrender the York territory to the godly kingdom. Under normal circumstances, Guinevere might consider joining the godly kingdom. However, after witnessing the Battle of the Victorians, he couldn't overlook the courageous warriors of Victoria City that had unlimited revivals. They were like holy warriors blessed by God. Only an angel could have such capability. He suspected many times that Queen Victoria could be an angel from the heavenly kingdom. Otherwise, how could her subjects have unlimited revivals? He passed the king's letter to Queen Victoria, who asked Big Boss Hamster to write a letter in return. The content of the letter would definitely be full of insults. King Potato II wrote a reply letter directly to Queen Victoria. The gamers got to know the content. It was simple, a declaration of war. After diplomacy failed, King Potato II decided to use his military might to get back the York territory. Would the gamers of Victoria City be fearful of war? Of course not. They were preparing diligently for war with the godly kingdom. They were exhilarated. I'm so envious. I regret not joining Victoria City. Do you see how happy the Victorians are? They can train under NPCs, partake in wars, and pillage other NPCs. That's so cool, Peasant said with envy. Not Wearing Pants smiled and said, "You're speaking as if you haven't pillaged Winterfell before. You've pillaged Winterfell a few times. There's no need to be envious. Don't we have many things to do?" They had a new mission, to go to the surface world and build a new stronghold. Chapter 477, Commercial Collaboration. In the dark forest, a few orcs surveyed the environment to see if there were any gamers from Victoria City moving around. The orcs were Arthur and his comrades. They should be pillaging the Duke's castle. I don't think there's anybody here in Victoria City. Peasant looked at the surroundings and didn't discover any human activity. After arriving from the teleport portal, they didn't approach Victoria City. Instead, they traveled in the opposite direction. There were many rocks and steep cliffs, so it was a suitable location for a secret stronghold. Arthur and his comrades were building a stronghold so that they could have a resting place on the surface world. Their plan was to log the trees secretly. The nearest location for selling wood was at the Crossroad Intersection outpost. However, the outpost was a good distance from the surface world. If they had a stronghold near the forest, the gamers wouldn't have to travel to the Crossroad Intersection outpost that frequently. They could log the trees for half a day and store the wood in the secret stronghold before returning to the Crossroad Intersection outpost. Even if the gamers of the surface world attacked them while they were logging, they wouldn't lose all their wood. The secret stronghold was a good place for them to go offline. They weren't aware that they were the first batch of underworld creatures that returned to the surface world after thousands of years. In the Eternal Kingdom dungeon, when Sherlock returned to the dungeon from the Merchant Alliance's manor, he conducted a friendly interview with Frangipani. However, Frangipani didn't know much since he was recently released from his imprisonment. The Ancient Gods army was using a similar mental connection to the connection between Sherlock and the gamers. That was why when the Ancient Gods army attacked Winterfell, all of the Ancient Gods believers from around the world rushed to Winterfell. Frangipani was part of this collective mental connection of the Ancient Gods. When Frangipani was brought back to Eternal Kingdom, he was like a mole for the Ancient Gods army. Sherlock wasn't aware of this fact. After carefully treating him to reduce the pain, the half-dead Frangipani was rid of his mental connection with the Ancient Gods. The parrot and the black kitten witnessed the entire process and got to know the gentle side of Lord Sherlock. However, it was only the beginning. The orc Cherry sat in his office. After a series of events, he was promoted from Garrison Guard Captain to the Chief of the Winterfell Garrison Guard Station. He was able to be a chief at such a young age because of his excellent performance in solving the volcano case and strong support from Lord Sherlock and Lord Nicholas. Cherry had a bright future. Even though he was a chief, he still handled everything himself instead of just giving orders in his office. For example, the Winterfell officials reported a shocking incident to the garrison guards. The wood in Forest Number 4 was all gone. It had become a barren desert. There weren't even any rocks. What's going on? Cherry looked at the desert, perplexed. He inhaled the smoke from the metal stick that was in his mouth. Z. His mouth emitted sizzling sounds and charred smoke. It mirrored his mind, which was in turmoil. Chief, could all the trees be logged by Eternal Kingdom? His colleague, who was holding a document folder, asked Cherry. Don't worry about your thoughts. We have to be bold in our thinking, speculation, and conclusion, Cherry said to his colleague. Yes, the colleague said proudly. He opened the document folder and said, from my records, the forest was leased to Eternal Kingdom 4 months ago. The lease was for a year, but it was returned to us a few days ago. Eternal Kingdom requested a refund of 8 months of lease. I'm thinking that they cut down all of the trees in 4 months and returned the land to us to save the remaining 8 months of lease. The garrison guards at the side inhaled cool gusts of air. They were in disbelief. That was Eternal Kingdom, the most promising and powerful dungeon with the highest number of warriors. Dungeon Lord Sherlock attended the banquets of the elites and was a notable socialite. Would such an influential character return the forest to save on 8 months of a lease? I heard that Eternal Kingdom returned the forest because the trees vanished. They were thinking of asking for compensation. The worker in the forest disagreed. He took out an application form and said, "This is the form filled up by Lord Sherlock. It states the sum that we're required to compensate him." Cherry remained calm. He took the form and examined it carefully before saying, from the form, Lord Sherlock is correct. Our lease is for a year, but the trees vanished after 4 months. It's reasonable for Lord Sherlock to demand compensation. Wait a moment, Chief. The Orc garrison guard, who accused Eternal Kingdom of logging all the trees, said, if they simply logged all of the trees, we won't have to pay any compensation. That's impossible. The worker in the forest immediately shouted. How many creatures are there in Eternal Kingdom? The forest is huge and requires special tools for logging. Not to mention that the logging staff has to be specially selected. We have a collaboration with the largest prison, Bankasia, but Eternal Kingdom and Bankasia didn't cooperate. How could he have a large logging crew? It's impossible to cut down the trees within 4 months. He's right. I don't think Eternal Kingdom is responsible for the missing trees. I have encountered the strange citizens of Eternal Kingdom before and don't think they're that decadent. I can see from their violent nature and thirst for battle that they have the special characteristics of an underworld warrior. As Chief Cherry was speaking up for the gamers, the other garrison guards didn't suspect Eternal Kingdom any further. Cherry was the detective that solved the Black Volcano case, which was the most sensational case in the Underworld. He couldn't possibly have erroneous speculations. The garrison guards no longer suspected that it was Eternal Kingdom that logged all of the trees. They started investigating the cause of the destruction of the trees, while the Merchant Alliance compensated Lord Sherlock and extended their apologies. Lord Sherlock was generous and didn't go after the Merchant Alliance, only requesting another forest as compensation. The lease would be a year. The Merchant Alliance didn't accede to his request. Instead, the Merchant Alliance compensated Lord Sherlock with magic stones and raw materials. Lord Sherlock accepted the compensation. Sherlock was busy planning an important project. He was diligently preparing for it. The light of the computer screen illuminated the walls of the Dungeon Lord main hall. The sounds of a mouse clicking and furious typing made the parrot blink his eyes in his cage. He saw Lord Sherlock working hard in front of the computer. The parrot turned his head away to prevent the light of the computer from disrupting his rest. Polio, who was resting in his dwelling, opened his eyes. He saw Sherlock working in front of the computer and sighed. Then he muttered, "Lord Sherlock is working too hard." It was soft, but it was still loud enough to be heard by Sherlock. Polio saw that Sherlock wasn't responding, and he sighed before sprawling down to sleep. His fawning tactic failed. Frangipani was hiding his body in his shell all the time. It was good to have a shell like a turtle. Eggface was also sitting in front of a computer, using great effort to control the mouse and keyboard with his claws. His eyes gazed intently at the computer screen. "Pick up the lanterns. Pick up the lanterns immediately." Eggface suddenly shouted. His voice gave the parrot and Black Kitten a fright. Sherlock was focused on the computer while he clicked rapidly on the mouse. He shouted to Eggface, "I can't light the lanterns. Help me give it a push. Give it a push." After shouting, Sherlock's hands left the keyboard and mouse. He covered his face while emitting SS's sounds. "Aya, what happened to you?" "Just like the lanterns," Eggface complained, while Sherlock closed his eyes and shook his head silently. If we remain at this level until the end of Season 9, we won't obtain the King's ranking. The season is ending. Eggface frowned as he yelled at Sherlock. He continued to grumble, but he suddenly realized that he was talking about Lord Sherlock. As a male, Lord Sherlock would never apologize for losing a game. Eggface pondered for a while and said, "I don't blame you, Lord Sherlock. You aren't able to master this version. Why don't you try the previous version? There is a strong opponent called the Shy, recently. Lord Sherlock will work towards defeating him. I feel you can beat him easily. Forget it, I'm not playing tonight. Rest early. The Underworld is having school holidays, so there are more students." Sherlock shut down his computer and leaned on his chair. He closed his eyes to rest, and Eggface shut down his computer reluctantly before bidding Sherlock good night. Then Eggface went to the corner of the room and sprawled in his nest. He had his own nest in the dungeon, but he preferred sleeping in the Dungeon Lord main hall. Sherlock didn't mind Eggface sleeping in his Dungeon Lord main hall. "Lord Sherlock," Brew said while Sherlock was resting his eyes. Sherlock replied. "Lord Sherlock, don't you have a plan? The ancient god's army is watching you closely. According to your belief, the Devil Management Committee isn't very reliable. You subdued 2 of Michelangelo's subordinates and captured the highest-ranking commander of the ancient god's army. There's also a creature who can revive Michelangelo in Evelyn's body. If it were another creature in your shoes, they would be a nervous wreck. But you aren't perturbed. You are even playing in a game tournament daily. I must say you have some skills." Sherlock opened his eyes and said, "Yes, I've said that it's not my problem. My attack damage carry is so strong. How could there be a problem?" "I'm not referring to the League of Legends, Lord Sherlock." Brew said. "What plans do you have? Do I have to give orders to fulfill your plans? Invade the prison of the ancient gods and kill them before killing the 7 devils of the Devil Management Committee. What do you think of my plan?" Sherlock didn't look like he was joking. Brew said excitedly, "You're indeed Lord Sherlock. You have such a comprehensive plan. Don't worry, I'll let the gamers fulfill your plan. As long as they can damage the ancient gods and the devils, it shouldn't be much of a problem for them." Brew was very confident in the gamers. He suggested occupying Winterfell as the base for arming and training the gamers. That was the first step in conquering the world. But Sherlock wasn't interested in Brew's ambition. After Brew expressed his ambition and plan in great detail, he suddenly remembered something and said to Sherlock, "Yes, Lord Sherlock, Tencent has been sending you messages. Have you seen them?" "What messages?" Sherlock asked bewilderedly. He wasn't concerned with Tencent's messages. It's about their intention to collaborate with us to promote the dungeon game. They want to invest in the first national invitational tournament. The computer before Sherlock started running, and Sherlock opened the document that Brew was talking about. The document was sent by Tencent and contained details of collaboration and future plans. The important points were the promotion of the open beta and setting up overseas gaming servers. Sherlock was interested in the first national invitational tournament. It wasn't an international tournament because Dungeon didn't have international gamers. All of the current gamers were from an Asian country. National Invitational Tournament? Are the Otherworld's gamers able to take part? Just like League of Legends? Sherlock asked after pondering. Besides the gamers killing each other in the wilderness and the guild wars in the arena, he didn't expect that the gamers could fight against each other in a tournament. "I think it's more like a World of Warcraft tournament. It's not as good as League of Legends. As the only game of its kind, I feel that if we organize a national invitational tournament, it'll spur the gamer's motivation. Before the start of the open beta, the tournament will increase our prestige. Once we take over Yggdrasil and can provide sufficient mana, we can invite more gamers to participate in our open beta. This sounds interesting. Send a letter to Tencent and express our interest. Let them do detailed planning," Sherlock said as he shut down his computer. He leaned back in his chair, but Brew said, "Lord Sherlock, what about the Devil Management Committee and the Ancient Gods Army?" "I understand, I'll kill all of them tomorrow," Sherlock said half-heartedly. Chapter 478, Escape. At the northern court of the Merchant Alliance. A black court was located at a plain that was 10 days' journey north of Winterfell. The Merchant Alliance had set up a restricted zone that had a radius of 5 kilometers around the court. This was the Merchant Alliance's control center for the Northern Underworld. Only the highest judge and the highest-ranking administrative officials were stationed here. The 9 judges here held the most power in the Merchant Alliance. They formed the most powerful administrative group for dealing with administration, law, and military affairs. Sherlock knew one of the judges, Onionhead. As a former Winterfell dungeon lord who survived the petrification incident, he was promoted to be one of the most powerful 9 judges. It was due to his many years and diligence in managing Winterfell, as well as his excellent capability. And most importantly, he had money. In the Merchant Alliance, money was power. Anything could be bought with money. The Merchant Alliance related a creature's capability to their earning power. The newly appointed judge, Onionhead, was familiar with his work. Even his current office was decorated according to his office in Winterfell. Onionhead sat in his chair as he looked around. He felt as though he was still a dungeon lord. Now, he was one of the most powerful judges in the northern underworld. Judge Onionhead, a creature would like to meet you, but he doesn't have an appointment. Just when Onionhead entered his office, a secretary knocked on his door and informed him. Who is it? Onionhead asked, but he didn't allow the creature to come in. He said he knows you. I told him that he can't meet you without an appointment, but he stood at the entrance and said that you'll meet him once you see this item. Onionhead stood up, bewildered. Then he opened the door, and the secretary passed him a strange badge that had the word, Michelangelo, on it. Let him come in. Onionhead pondered for a while and said, keep this discreet. The secretary was taken aback, but he quickly went out. A sludge monster who was wearing a gray overcoat and a pair of shades came in. Though he was trying to disguise himself, anybody could recognize him as a sludge monster. It has been a long time, Dungeon Lord Onionhead. No, I should address you as Judge Onionhead. Onionhead felt as though the sludge monster knew him. He was puzzled, however, as he had never seen this sludge monster. He gestured for the secretary to leave, then invited the sludge monster to sit down. Onionhead didn't speak first. He was waiting for the sludge monster to state his intention and the reason he had Michelangelo's badge. Dungeon Lord Onionhead. The sludge monster smiled knowingly and said, this is all a karmic cycle. We can't ignore it. The final stage of the plan is being carried out. We need your help, Judge Onionhead. Apologies, I think you might be mistaken. I don't intend to take part in any conspiracy or plan. I'm working for the Merchant Alliance. I'm not a conspirator, Onionhead said as he fiddled with the badge and looked at the sludge monster. Really? Why did you let me in when you saw the badge of Michelangelo? The sludge monster took down his shades and placed them on the table. He smiled affably and said, Judge Onionhead is concerned about Michelangelo. The revival of Michelangelo is in progress. Onionhead was in disbelief. He said, how can it be? A group of strange humans, elves, and fairies with green symbols above their heads appeared in York territory. They ran around in the villages of the York territory while wearing the confident smiles of a victor. The gamers of Victoria City made every creature in the York territory tremble. They would enter and ransack the homes of the villagers, but they didn't take anything. Instead, they would complain, why aren't there any pieces of equipment? A potion would suffice. Only the luxurious clothes, furniture, ornaments, and equipment of the nobles were taken away by the gamers. A villager tried to offer an old hen to a Victorian officer in order to obtain the chance to join the troops of Victoria City. It was flatly declined. The gamers didn't keep the old hen. They waved their hands and said, I can't accept the chicken god. The entire village will come after me. The Victorian officer was actually a guild chairman. When he entered the villages, many guild members would follow him. To the villages, he looked like an officer. As the poor villages had nothing of value to the gamers, it looked like the gamers didn't pillage them. The image of the gamers of Victoria City was elevated in the eyes of the commoners. The officials spread rumors that the gamers were bandits that destroyed their homeland. To the villagers, it was untrue. Only the rich nobles were in trouble. The pillaging only lasted for a few days. The gamers found that it was useless to run around the villages in the York territory. That was because they were unable to return to Victoria City rapidly and obtain their daily missions. Hence, they were unable to get rewards and reputation points. The gamers had to go to the Crossroad Intersection Outpost to obtain the relevant reputation points. If the gamers stayed in the York territory, they would be unable to complete the missions at the Crossroad Intersection Outpost and would lose out in terms of reputation points. There were few gamers of Victoria City that could exchange their loot for reputation points and rewards. However, Even if they pillaged a lot of furniture and equipment, it couldn't be compared to the rewards provided by Sherlock. Moreover, the revival point was far away. If they died during exploration, the equipment would be lost in the wilderness. Not many gamers were able to retrieve their equipment or redeem their equipment at the Freedom Cities. The competition among the gamers was intense, especially the guild wars and the fighting in the wilderness. More and more gamers chose to return to Victoria City and the Crossroad Intersection Outpost to complete their missions, as these places had more game content. Some gamers were passionate about exploration. They discovered that the surface world map was much larger than they thought. There were many different nobles. To the gamers, these nobles were the different factions that they could interact with. Not many gamers could survive the exploration, but there were a few lucky and capable gamers who made it. A few gamers contacted the outside nobles. Due to the gamer's victory in the York territory, the powerful combat prowess of the gamers spread like wildfire in the kingdom. The gamers contacted the nobles and agreed to let their guild members work for the nobles in exchange for money and equipment. More and more nobles tried all sorts of ways to recruit these miraculous mercenaries that were very affordable. A baron was lucky to recruit many gamers of Victoria City. The baron's territory was next to the York territory. The situation was tense. The baron was fighting with his nephew, who was the neighboring baron, for succession of the territory. His nephew usurped his title. Though the baron's power was inferior to that of his nephew, he didn't intend to give up. He managed to recruit 100 warriors of Victoria City. During the battle, the 100 warriors brought along hundreds of gamers of Victoria City to participate in the battle. The courageous Victorians defeated the army of his nephew. When the gamers appeared on the battlefield screaming, the green symbols above their heads scared off most of the enemies. Those were the warriors of Victoria City. Their notoriety was enough to scare off most people. During the battle at the York territory, it was said that they could break deep into the enemy's skull and eat the enemy's eyeballs while smiling. They could play chess while cutting up their arms for treatment. Some people described them as monsters who could hail the winds and rain. They wore tattered clothing while releasing unimaginable mana. There was even an ugly and naked creature who wielded a metal hammer while emitting sacred light. How could that be human? It was too terrifying. More and more nobles became fascinated with the warriors of Victoria City. This strange power was in a war with King Potato II, who declared he would be using his military might to take back the York territory. It wasn't a problem to recruit the warriors of Victoria City discreetly. Nobody knew when the king's army would attack Victoria City. Perhaps the king would use his money to bribe them? The reputation of Victoria City was at its peak. Golden-haired George rode his horse and wandered tiredly in the forest. He had nothing warm to eat for 2 days, only eating worms and the rabbits that he caught. He didn't dare to barbecue the rabbit, afraid the smoke would attract the attention of the Victorians. He wouldn't be lucky enough to escape. George's temperament had been tempered by his defeats under the Victorians. His troops were killed by their attrition tactic. The reinforcements of the counts were also annihilated by the same tactic. Their fate was similar to his. During the final stage of the battle, when they intended to escape, they were surrounded by the warriors of Victoria City. They didn't know when they were besieged, but all of their escape routes were blocked. It was an unforgettable defeat. George could only escape on horseback and abandon his master, the Duke of York. His pride and confidence had been shattered by the Victorians. The once formidable knight was now down and out. After ensuring that there was nobody around, George heaved a sigh of relief. He secured his horse to a tree branch and dismounted, then sat down against a tree trunk. He picked a blade of grass and put it into his mouth to chew. He didn't have anything to eat. He wasn't eating the grass, but the chewing made him feel satiated. That was what his teacher taught him. The previously well-off George didn't expect to use such knowledge. He looked frantically for prey to fill his stomach. At that moment, he heard movements in the trees. Was there prey for him? He quickly stood up and grasped the hilt of his sword as he looked warily at the trees in front. He thought it was a small animal, but from its movement, its size was huge. Was it a tiger? But there shouldn't be any tigers nearby. Perhaps it was the Victorians? He wasn't sure whether he should flee. From the sounds, there were at most 2 people. When the sounds got closer, he was sure there was only a person on horseback. George decided to kill off this pursuer. If the pursuer survived, he would reveal his location to more warriors of Victoria City. George grasped his sword as he hid behind a tree trunk. He had thought of many methods to kill the pursuer when he passed by. George was confident in his own combat prowess. However, his plan was wrecked. When the pursuer rode his horse by, George swung his longsword and slashed at the person's upper body. According to his estimate, he could avoid the horse while the longsword would slit the person's throat. It was only his wishful thinking. When the horse passed by George's position, he swung his blade at the rider, but the rider evaded the attack and rolled down off the horse. The rider unsheathed his weapon and slashed at George, who parried instinctively. When George was about to counterattack, he was taken aback. That was the defeated Count Steamed Dumpling. "It's you." The two of them looked at each other dejectedly and yelled in astonishment. Steamed Dumpling's horse was secured next to George's horse. They sat together by the tree trunk, grabbed some grass, and chewed it in their mouths. They shared their escape experience. During the chaotic battle, they rode on their horses to break out of the Victorian siege. They then entered the forest to cast off their pursuers. "Where do you intend to go?" George looked at Steamed Dumpling and asked. "I don't know. I'll escape from the York territory first before making other plans." Steamed Dumpling lowered his head and replied earnestly. "It's going to be difficult. I thought of escaping the York territory, but there were bounty notices for capturing us. The guards who were loyal to the king defected to the new Duke of York and Queen Victoria. If the guards spot us, they'll capture and even kill us." George said, "I just escaped from the town. What good plans do you have?" Steamed Dumpling asked with concern. George was a knight who grew up in the York territory, and he was familiar with the area. He was definitely more familiar with the York territory than Steamed Dumpling. George nodded and pointed to a direction as he said, "We'll go in the direction of Victoria City. Not many warriors of Victoria City can be found along the way. We'll escape from there." Chapter 479, Prisoner. There were lots of dangerous beasts hidden in the dark forest, but Steamed Dumpling and George continued to walk for a long period of time without seeing any beasts. They didn't even see any small animals. As they approached Victoria City, it became apparent that there were no small animals, not even small rabbits. "Did the warriors of Victoria City eat all the animals?" George said jokingly. Steamed Dumpling didn't expect George to joke. After all, they had gone through life and death and hadn't yet reached a safe place. Who knew when there would be Victorians appearing? Steamed Dumpling didn't respond. George felt that his joke was inappropriate, so he remained silent as he led the way. When they ventured deeper into the forest, the frequency that George stopped to find paths became longer. To evade the Victorians, George didn't use the usual paths. He chose deserted paths that made him lose his way. George was lost, but he didn't tell Steamed Dumpling. He preferred escaping with a companion. He remained calm. Fortunately, the forest looked less dense. It seemed like they were going out of the forest. George couldn't ascertain his location, so he could only take it a step at a time. He couldn't possibly walk out of the king's territory. They didn't know that they had walked out of the king's territory and walked into the territory of Eternal Kingdom. To be precise, it was the stronghold that the gamers of Eternal Kingdom had built on the surface world. When they arrived at the edge of the forest, they hugged each other in excitement. They thought they would never walk out of the forest. They could even have been caught by the warriors of Victoria City. "Sir George, thanks to you, I'm able to survive. Though the Duke of York has passed on, I believe the king will remember the Duke's contributions. I won't forget your help," Steamed Dumpling said excitedly as he looked at the barren surroundings. If they continued walking, they would enter hilly terrain. He asked, "Sir George, do you know how to proceed from here?" "Let's go to the nearest town of the kingdom." George hesitated before speaking. "Actually, Strange sounds were heard from the forest behind. They became nervous, thinking the Victorians had caught up with them. It wasn't the first time they encountered such a situation. They dashed towards a huge rock by the side, but they didn't manage to hide their horses. The sounds came closer. When they were hidden, 4 to 5 people walked to their previous spots. "I heard some sounds here. Someone was speaking the language of Victoria City. Dungeon language." "What's that language?" The officials said that it's the surface world common language, not the language of Victoria City. "Dungeon language, as long as you can understand. Why are you so fussy about the details?" "Dungeon language, stop chatting. Let's look around. Wait, there are 2 horses." "Dungeon language, They found the 2 horses left by Steamed Dumpling and George. There were pieces of luggage on the back of the horses. Sweat was dripping down the forehead of Steamed Dumpling. He was hesitating about whether to escape. If the enemies rode the horses to pursue him, he wouldn't be able to escape. He should have ridden his horse and fled. As the enemies came stealthily, Steamed Dumpling didn't have the chance to react. Hence, he was trapped in this precarious situation. Steamed Dumpling regretted chatting with George. That was how he got into this mess. George was also looking grave. It was as though mixed clay had locked up his brows. Both of them held their breaths as the enemies led their horses away. The horses snorted uncomfortably, but they couldn't resist because of the reins. The enemies chatted with a strange language. Why are there only horses? We didn't see any of the gamers from Victoria City. Dungeon language. Aren't you happy with the horses? Isn't it better the gamers of Victoria City aren't here? We'll take their horses away. Dungeon language. Stop talking. Arthur and the rest are still waiting for us. Let's hurry back and help them with the trees. The gamers of Victoria City are busy pillaging the York territory. Let's make haste. If we're discovered by them, it will be troublesome. Dungeon language. The enemies seemed to be leaving, but the footsteps didn't sound right. They were approaching the hidden location of Steamed Dumpling and George. Steamed Dumpling panicked. He stood up and fled without looking back. George followed behind Steamed Dumpling. Whoever was slower would die. George ran closely behind Steamed Dumpling. They were blocked by a group of strange creatures. That was a group of orcs, gnomes, and houndhead men. George and Steamed Dumpling were dumbstruck. They had never seen such strange creatures. Orcs and gnomes hadn't appeared on the surface world for thousands of years, and the houndhead man was a strange and terrifying creature. They aren't citizens of Victoria City. They're NPCs. Dungeon language. That's golden-haired George and Count Steamed Dumpling. I saw photographs and videos of them. That's how they're being called if my memory serves me right. Dungeon language. Wait, George and Count Steamed Dumpling? Aren't they fugitives of Duke Guinevere? Dungeon language. Are you sure? Are they fugitives? If we capture them, can we exchange them for rewards with Guinevere? Dungeon language. How can a gamer of Eternal Kingdom obtain the rewards of Victoria City? Good idea. Aren't you afraid of being hacked to death when you enter Victoria City? Dungeon language. What you said makes sense. I'll be hacked even before meeting Guinevere. Dungeon language. The strange creatures were smiling and chatting while pointing at George and Steamed Dumpling. To George and Steamed Dumpling, they were more horrifying than the warriors of Victoria City. At least they could still communicate with the Victorians, but these creatures had never been seen before. Wait, Steamed Dumpling was taken aback. His education as a noble taught him about legendary creatures like the Underworld creatures. Thousands of years ago, Michelangelo led his army and tried to conquer the world. Even the surface world inhabitants heard of this legend before. The creatures that followed Michelangelo looked like what Steamed Dumpling and George saw now. Were these creatures from the Underworld? All the tunnels going into the Underworld were sealed according to legend. Why were there such creatures? Steamed Dumpling wasn't a staff member of the church or a savior of the world. He was fearful and wanted to escape. He turned around, but his escape route was blocked by the 4 orcs. The Underworld creatures started to chat. They spoke slowly as they got closer. They looked like they were going to capture Steamed Dumpling and George alive. With their numbers and size, Steamed Dumpling wouldn't be able to last 3 seconds against them. The axe of an orc was larger than Steamed Dumpling. Previously, the human world defeated the Underworld by using the power of sacred light. Steamed Dumpling was a knight, but he didn't possess the power. I'm Sir George from the Godly Kingdom. I don't know where you came from. If you can understand me, please go away. This forest is the territory of the Godly Kingdom. We have a powerful army nearby. If you're discovered, you'll be killed. George attempted to communicate with the creatures, but the gamers of Eternal Kingdom couldn't understand him. The gamers of Eternal Kingdom could use Mandarin to communicate with gamers of Victoria City, but it was impossible to communicate with the surface world's NPCs. The gamers of Eternal Kingdom chatted for a while and eventually decided to capture the 2 NPCs. They weren't sure if they could obtain the bounty, but it could be a strange encounter. Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom were 2 opposing factions. Perhaps they could form an alliance with their prisoners. They thought of forming an alliance with the surface world's humans to fight against Victoria City. The gamers tried to communicate with George and Steamed Dumpling with their underworld language, but they were unable to understand. The gamers resorted to body language to communicate. The gamer's patience wore thin as their communication efforts failed. Capture them first. Dungeon language, a gamer suggested as he extended his hand towards Steamed Dumpling and George to capture them. But George raised his longsword and severed the palm of the orc gamer. Though an orc's constitution was superior to a human, the flesh was unable to defend against metal. The palm of the orc flew high up, crimson blood splattering everywhere. The orc gamer didn't expect the two NPCs to fight back. Should the intelligent NPC not be surrendering and offering his equipment? Previously, when the gamers of Victoria City were fighting against the Knights of the Duke, that was how the Knights surrendered. The Knights offered their horses and equipment before being released. The gamers of Victoria City weren't interested in killing NPCs, as the NPCs could provide strange encounter missions. There were no reputation points or rewards for killing NPCs. The gamers only wanted equipment, so there was no reason for the gamers to kill the NPCs. The gamers of Eternal Kingdom had no intention to kill George and Steamed Dumpling, as they could provide strange encounter missions. In fact, NPCs were highly valued by the gamers. However, it was a different story if the NPCs retaliated. The gamers unsheathed their weapons and shouted aggressively. They dashed at George and Steamed Dumpling, who raised their longswords and fought back. As they thought they were going to die, George and Steamed Dumpling fought valiantly. Their combat skills were unparalleled. The gamers had no intention to kill the NPCs, so many of them were injured during the fight. Tens of gamers surrounded the NPCs in the fight. Finally, the odds were in the gamers' favor. George and Steamed Dumpling were powerful against normal humans, but they couldn't possibly fight against tens of orcs. The orcs weren't afraid of wounds and death. Moreover, Steamed Dumpling and George were exhausted after fleeing for a few days. Soon, George and Steamed Dumpling were fatigued. An orc dashed forward and swung his axe at George's shoulder. George closed his eyes as he awaited his death, but he heard a loud, pom, sound. The axe-wielding orc was knocked down by another orc who shouted at George. George didn't know what the orc was shouting about. The orc threw a spider silk rope at George that he had never seen before. The orc looked dominant. When he appeared, the creatures that attacked him stopped and stood by the side. George noticed that there were many orcs riding darting birds on a hill nearby. They were coming towards him. The orc leader made a gesture of tying up George and pointed at the rope on the ground before putting his hand on his neck and making a killing gesture. George understood that the orc leader wanted to humiliate him and tie him up before killing him. George was a knight. Though he was being pursued relentlessly by the Victorians, he would never kneel down and be killed by his enemies. He roared angrily and wanted to perish together with his enemies. He raised his longsword and slashed at the orc leader. If he was lucky, he could injure and take the orc leader hostage. He could have a chance to survive. He was hit on the back of the head and fell to the ground. The last thing he saw was Steamed Dumpling being pushed to the ground by another orc. It must have been an orc who hit him on the back of the head. The orc who was wielding two daggers was very weird. He was emitting strange lights as though he was enchanted by mana. The orc didn't attack him with the blades of his daggers. Instead, he used the hilt of a dagger to hit the back of George's head. The orc was muttering to himself, but George couldn't understand. His vision went black, and he fell to the ground. "What shall we do, Arthur?" Burning chest hair asked Arthur as he looked at the two fallen NPCs. Arthur wanted George and Steamed Dumpling to tie their own hands. He would then ensure that they weren't killed. But they misunderstood Arthur and attacked. It wasn't a problem, as the other gamers attacked both of them from behind. "Bring them back and ask Sherlock if there are any strange encounter missions. I feel that Sherlock will be interested in both of them," Arthur said. Chapter 480. Sherlock's Plan. Steamed Dumpling and George weren't killed after being captured by a group of orcs. When both of them regained consciousness, they were tied to strange birds with two large legs. The birds looked like up-sized ostriches. George realized that he was the prisoner of these strange underworld creatures. His hands and legs were tied. His body was secured to the back of the darting bird, so he was unable to escape. The rope that bound him was made of spider silk. Even huge dire wolves and ogres were unable to break free of the rope. The gamers of Eternal Kingdom discovered that George had regained consciousness. They gathered and chatted before Arthur came over. Arthur tried body language to communicate with the prisoners, but they were unable to understand him. Arthur gave up trying to communicate using body language. George looked at his surroundings. There were rocks everywhere, similar to a cave. Strange vines wrapped around the sides of the rocks and glowed. The illumination from the vines wasn't as bright as the surface world's sun. Arthur and his companions were escorting the NPCs back to the Crossroad Intersection Outpost and to Eternal Kingdom via the teleport portal. Arthur wanted to inform Lord Sherlock that they had captured the two NPCs and see if they had triggered any strange encounter missions. Arthur had considered handing the prisoners to Duke Guinevere, but he decided not to since he was sure they would be attacked by the gamers of Victoria City. They were from opposing factions, so they would attack on sight. There were no secrets among the gamers. News of the capture of George and Steamed Dumpling by the Pioneer Alliance spread on the discussion forum, and the gamers of Victoria City tried to get back their NPCs by attacking the Pioneer Alliance. However, the guild members of the Pioneer Alliance and its allies helped to fight the gamers of Victoria City. There were only a few conflicts. They spent most of their time searching for the whereabouts of the Pioneer Alliance. The dungeon was too large. Arthur and his companions brought along the two NPCs and snuck into the Crossroad Intersection Outpost. When they entered the safe zone, the gamers of Victoria City were unable to do anything. How exhausting. We haven't gone offline for 2 days. Peasant led a pair of darting birds and the orcs into the Crossroad Intersection Outpost. He was relieved. He was in charge of leading the team with the two NPCs. The other guild members were responsible for distracting the attention of the opposing gamers. Arthur, not wearing pants, and Sylvanas were notable gamers. Most of the opposing gamers were watching them. Peasant was rather low profile, so he was suitable for the escorting task. When the two NPCs were brought to Eternal Kingdom, numerous gamers came to watch. They had watched videos of Lancelot, but it was their first time seeing NPCs that were involved in the plot of Victoria City. Especially when the two NPCs could help develop the subsequent plot. The gamers were curious about what kind of strange encounter missions they would bring. They followed Arthur and his companions to the Dungeon Lord main hall. Sherlock had already learned about it a few days ago, but he didn't stop the gamers. When Sherlock walked out of the Dungeon Lord main hall, he raised his hand and made George and Steamed Dumpling fall into a deep sleep. Sherlock gave Arthur and his companions generous rewards like equipment, game currency, and reputation points. He had no intention of interrogating the two NPCs. Instead, he gave Arthur and his companions a new mission. That was to find a chance to free George and Steamed Dumpling. Arthur was puzzled by the game plot. Why did he have to free them when they had just captured the NPCs? If Sherlock wanted to attack Victoria City or the surface world, he should be interrogating the two NPCs or subverting them. But Sherlock didn't explain. He only reminded Arthur and his companions to follow his orders. The game system displayed the corresponding notice before the gamers. Mission title: Release Golden-Haired George and Count Steamed Dumpling. Mission description: Lord Sherlock isn't interested in George and Count Steamed Dumpling. He thinks that both of them are wasting his food in Eternal Kingdom. It's better to release them back to the surface world and let them spread the name of Eternal Kingdom. Then the surface world's humans will tremble in fear. Mission objective: escort George and Steamed Dumpling to the surface world without being stopped by other gamers. Mission reward: the participating gamers can obtain equipment, game currency, and reputation points. The mission rewards were generous, so Arthur didn't reject the mission. Sherlock surely had his reasons for sending the NPCs back to the surface world. Arthur would understand Sherlock's intentions 2 days later. Lord Sherlock declared war on Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria reciprocated. The leaders of the opposing factions didn't have an epic start to the war, but the gamers thought that it was only a matter of time. Everything went according to Sherlock's plan. In the castle of Victoria City, Sherlock: I can't understand why you won't let me attack the king or help me attack the king. Instead, you're starting a military exercise with me. What's this about? Queen Victoria sat in her chair. 2 days ago, she declared war on Eternal Kingdom. She was going to lead her people to destroy the evil Eternal Kingdom. But now, she was sitting with Lord Sherlock and sipping jasmine red tea while he was having bloody chrysanthemum tea. We don't want to be attacked by the king. It's not the time to conquer the world. I believe that your aim isn't to just occupy the humans' territory. Our final aim is to attack the heavenly kingdom. Lilo, don't forget, Sherlock said casually. The declaration of war was part of Sherlock's plot. The existence of Victoria City had been exposed. According to Lilo's character, she would be attacking all of the human cities. She wasn't a decadent angel who could restrain herself. She also wouldn't consider the complexity of the human world's politics. Instead, she would use brute force to deal with all of the problems. She usurped the York territory of the godly kingdom without thinking and intended to launch a full-scale war with the kingdom. Sherlock didn't intend to interfere with the affairs of Victoria City, but the city was providing Eternal Kingdom with precious resources. He wanted Victoria City to exist peacefully. Moreover, he had just discovered Yggdrasil. He wanted to make use of Victoria City to control Yggdrasil. He couldn't afford Victoria City to be a warring city, as the fairies hated humans who were belligerent. If he wanted to interact with the fairies, it was important for Victoria City to have a good name. For example, the surface world's savior or shield of faith. These titles were pretty good. Hence, Victoria City had to defeat the evil creatures of Eternal Kingdom. The fairies hated the Underworld creatures the most. If Victoria City could stop the invasion of the Underworld, then the godly kingdom would have no reason to attack Victoria City. The fairies would also have a good impression of Victoria City. Sherlock wouldn't give up his plan, which killed two birds with one stone. This would also provide new game content to the gamers. After some observation, Sherlock was supportive of the PvP fighting among the gamers. Of course, he wouldn't tell all of that to Lilo. This is to train the combat power of the warriors. To fight against the heavenly kingdom, their pitiful combat power isn't enough. I feel that there's too little interaction with Victoria City, and more interaction is needed. This is to build up their rapport with each other when we lead the gamers of Victoria City and Eternal Kingdom to attack the Heavenly Kingdom. What do you think? Sherlock didn't have to obtain Lilo's opinion since she had already followed his request and declared war on Eternal Kingdom. When is the military exercise? What's the location? Lilo asked. I'm here for a detailed discussion, Sherlock said to Lilo. The battle between the opposing factions must have a plot animation. Sherlock was well aware of that. The gamers were anticipating a showdown between Lord Sherlock and Queen Victoria. The start of the war would be the battle between Sherlock and Lilo. It wasn't a real fight but a performance for the gamers to watch. Based on the prestige of Sherlock and Lilo, they had to create epic effects like explosions and total mayhem to show off their prowess. Hence, Sherlock had to discuss the creation of the effects with Lilo. Then he had to arrange for the gamers of Eternal Kingdom to attack Victoria City viciously while the gamers of Victoria City defended the world against waves of evil creatures. Queen Victoria wouldn't be the one to tell the world about the feats of Victoria City. Sherlock arranged for George and Steamed Dumpling to do that. That was the reason Sherlock was letting George and Steamed Dumpling go. George sat in his prison while trying hard to stay awake. The back of his skull was still painful. The orc used great force to hit the back of his skull with his dagger's hilt. George wasn't in a good mental state these few days. It was a miracle that he wasn't clubbed to death. He was in a daze due to the injury to the back of his skull. He was hazy about the battles that occurred when he was being escorted to Eternal Kingdom. Occasionally, when he was conscious, he would be told of how the Victorians tried to attack the orcs who captured him. He didn't know why the Victorians wanted to get him back from the orcs, but it was obviously not for the bounty. He thought it was the hatred of the surface world's races towards the underworld creatures. Both George and Steamed Dumpling cherished their lives, while the Victorians didn't care about their lives. They were more concerned about honor. Steamed Dumpling thought he would be freed from the orcs, but the Victorians didn't defeat the underworld creatures. The attacks of the Victorians were neutralized. Then both of them arrived at an unknown stronghold. They were kept in cages that were covered with thick skin blankets, so Steamed Dumpling wasn't able to observe the surroundings. He only knew that they went through a teleport portal with the orcs and arrived at a huge dungeon. The size and grandiose nature of the dungeon made him gape in astonishment. Steamed Dumpling didn't expect to see such a prosperous underground city. Eternal Kingdom was far more prosperous than the Duke's castle. This was the result of the effort of the gamers and Sherlock's generous development. Eternal Kingdom was no longer the abandoned dungeon that it once was. Steamed Dumpling wanted to survive, so he thought about how to escape. Looking at the bustling dungeon, it was impossible to flee. Since the underworld creatures had discovered the tunnel to the surface world, they could attack the surface world very soon. From his observations, the underworld creatures had most likely started their attacks on the surface world and encountered the fearless Victorians. After all, Victoria City was built near the entrance of the tunnels. That was how the warriors of Victoria City and the underworld creatures fought until now. Why did the Victorians not ask for help? Steamed Dumpling was puzzled. If they announced the news of the underworld creatures, the human kingdoms would definitely send help. Even the church would send people to help them fight against the underworld creatures. Though humans weren't very united, there at least wouldn't be things like the Duke of York attacking Victoria City. If Victoria City was the stronghold that was resisting the underworld creatures, then the Duke of York might have even sent money. Nobody wanted the underworld creatures to appear on the surface world. Memories of the Great Devil and his evil minions who almost conquered the world thousands of years ago were still remembered. There were still legends and stories of the horrifying underworld and the Great Devil. If Victoria City was attacked during this time, the attackers would be subjected to diplomatic and military sanctions by other nobles. These weren't the things to be considered by Steamed Dumpling. He couldn't even ensure his survival. He sighed as he leaned his head against the cold wall. He didn't expect to be in such a state. He wasn't a hero that fought against the underworld creatures. Instead, he had become their prisoner.